operatives. And the recording is in progress for those of you who are wondering, and Reliant. So again, thank you so much for your bronze sponsorship. Again, what I'd like to do at this point is introduce someone who I've known and admired for several years. I get a chance to introduce Deputy Secretary Joanna Reese, who, like me, is a native North Carolinian. I'm from Durham. She is actually from Goldsboro, so native of Wayne County. As Deputy Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs, Joanna leads state and federal government affairs for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. She has more than 28 years in state and local government, serving in positions with NCDOT, with the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners. Deputy Secretary Reese was NCDOT's legislative liaison for more than 4 years and served as Deputy Commissioner for the Division of Motor Vehicles for nearly 2 years. She's a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a degree in journalism and political science, and is a graduate of the UNC Chapel Hill School of Government, Municipal, and County Administration program. Deputy Secretary Reese, we are thrilled to have you here. Joanna, it's great to see you. We will turn this podium over to you.
Good to see everyone, some of you in person for the first time in quite a while. The North Carolina Chamber is an important voice across our state and one of NCDOT's key partners. It's encouraging to see so many of you here taking an interest in transportation. This only makes our network stronger. It's quite an interesting time to be in transportation. I first joined the department in 2006 for my first tour at DOT. And when I returned in 2019, the transportation landscape had definitively changed. Technology is playing a much greater role in our work. Climate change is making its effects known on our infrastructure. People are actually interested in modes of transportation beyond a single owner passenger vehicle. And we're really worried about adequate revenue to fulfill our mission. So we face challenges, but also some exciting opportunities. Changes are coming, and DOT is preparing for them, but we need our partners to be fully successful. I first want to update you on the most recent work regarding the State Transportation Improvement Program, the STIP. This is our 10-year planning document that provides a timeline for upcoming transportation projects, helping local governments better plan and understand what projects are coming to their communities. Challenges in recent years revealed a need to take a hard look at how the department developed the STIP. Cost estimates on many of our projects are outdated. Our partners in the construction industry are facing struggles with access to materials, rising costs, and labor shortages. We're seeing higher submissions from our bidders. In 2020, we began reviewing costs of projects to get more realistic numbers for our STIP. And last year, we paused what would have been our latest STIP update, Prioritization 6.0, to complete this review. During the review, we discovered some shortcomings in our process. We were using outdated cost estimating tools, which we have fixed. And we were not consistently updating costs for right-of-way, utilities, or construction. Going forward, we will update project costs at a minimum every 2 years. We also began looking more closely at our projects through value assessment engineering. In the past, we might have added to the original scope of a project or increased the boundary limits. Some of these changes were unnecessary and not directly related to the original purpose of the project. This, in effect, takes money away from another project. To date, over $180 million in recommended savings have been implemented into the STIP through value engineering. After all this, we have completed the review of the STIP for the 2024 to 2033 timeframe. To be more transparent, we have overhauled the format of the document the public and our partners use to look up STIP projects. Okay, who in here has ever tried to read the STIP? I have to click the plus button on the online magnifier about 10 times, and you're trying to scroll and look at the headings. So yes, we've worked on that. This new document will be in a much easier spreadsheet format to read and will include sorting and filtering functions. We're working with our local partners, the MPOs and RPOs, and with the Board of Transportation right now to get some initial feedback. The department plans to release a preliminary draft 10-year capital building document next month. Following the release, we'll hold outreach sessions with the MPOs and RPOs and we'll seek public input on the draft this summer. Our staff and the Board of Transportation will then take the feedback and finalize the draft for release in December of this year. We expect to have the final 2024 to 2033 STIP by next summer. We're seeing rapid technological change today, and emerging technologies will disrupt how we've always done business. You can't turn your head away from the mic when you're wearing it. Vehicles will be, or in some cases already are, more connected, more autonomous, which used to seem like complete science fiction, shared. Who else here loves the rideshare services? And electric. With so many manufacturers committing to publicly to transitioning their product, this is happening much faster than any of us expected. For instance, we're seeing innovations that are extending the driving range for electric vehicles and making them more comfortable, more affordable. But it's important to note that these emerging technologies, along with behavioral changes, such as remote work, online everything, and ride sharing, will affect the department's revenue. As you know, about half of our revenue at DOT comes from the gas tax. We use that money to build and maintain the state's infrastructure and to provide transportation services such as traffic management and the DMV services. We're a fast-growing state with looming transportation needs. DOT and others in the state are looking at long-term strategies to help replace the gas tax revenues we have relied upon. The gentleman who introduced me helped lead the NC First Commission, a 2-year effort that generated multiple options for new transportation revenue. Thank you, Ward, for your leadership and your commitment to that effort. The Chamber has done excellent work in this area, as has a legislative commission. All of this pointing to not just the need, but viable options for new revenue. We are hoping to have success in the upcoming legislative session on new revenue for transportation, and we're asking for your help to get there. This will be a multi-year effort, but as rapidly as changes are occurring, we need to get started. We're excited by what all this new technology will bring, including fewer emissions and a cleaner environment. Governor Cooper is ensuring North Carolina will be a leader in this arena. In January, the governor issued Executive Order 246, which builds upon his Executive Order 80 from 2018. The new order reaffirms North Carolina's commitment to a clean energy economy, directs next steps in the state's plan to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and creates economic opportunities for North Carolinians across the state, especially in underserved communities. The two overarching goals of Executive Order 246 are, by 2030, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 50% below 2005 levels and achieve net zero emissions no later than 2050. Also, by 2030, increase the number of zero emission vehicles to 1.25 million and increase ZEV sales so that 50% of new vehicles are ZEV. As of now, we have a little over 40,000 registered or electric plug-in vehicles in our state out of about 10 million registered vehicles. So yes, these are ambitious goals, but it takes ambition to move a state into the future. Moving the state forward on clean transportation will have a lasting impact on our state and its people for generations to come. To help achieve these goals, the order directs DOT to develop a clean transportation plan. The development of the plan, which has already started, includes strong stakeholder involvement, including an advisory committee that meets monthly, 5 topic-specific working groups that will do a deep dive into certain areas, and multiple public involvement meetings. This plan will seek to decarbonize North Carolina's transportation sector by addressing the availability, the sales, and the usage of ZEVs, including medium and heavy-duty vehicles, not just passenger vehicles. Considering ways to reduce vehicle miles traveled, investing in clean transportation infrastructure the charging stations will need, improving equitable access to clean mobility, and increasing access to alternative modes of transportation. The plan also has an aggressive timetable. It's due a year from this month, so we have a lot of work to do between now and then. Achieving this critical goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state through increases in non-combustion engine vehicles further points to the need to modernize our transportation revenue. We're always looking to the future at DOT. That goes for how we prepare for weather and climate disruptions, which we all expect to see more of in the coming years. We're seeing stronger, more frequent storms in North Carolina, and we've seen that even a flash flood or an isolated storm can do damage to smaller roads and culverts. The people we serve expect infrastructure to be more resilient to changing weather patterns. That's why we have implemented a department-wide resiliency policy. We are working to incorporate natural hazard resiliency into all of our procedures and processes, from planning to maintenance. And we're partnering with local, state, and federal agencies to address resiliency statewide. On the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, we are so grateful our partners in Washington recognize the need to modernize critical transportation infrastructure. The act will bring an estimated $410 million more each year over the next 5 years for NCDOT projects, for the state's projects, in addition to numerous competitive grant opportunities. NCDOT has always been very aggressive in going after competitive grants, and we will continue to do so through the opportunities in this act. This kind of infusion of new money will help North Carolina remain competitive in this new transportation environment. The act also looks at many of the issues and the challenges that I've spoken of today. After calculating this new federal money, we are still $7 to $8 billion over programmed in the next step, but that is a massive improvement and help from the $11 billion shortfall we had before the act was passed, and we're so grateful to have that. We know some communities will be disappointed that projects have been delayed or even dropped off of our 10-year plan. This further points to the need for more funding to keep up with the many transportation priorities and projects in a fast-growing state like ours. Again, I and all of NCDOT are so grateful for the partners the department has that help keep our transportation network strong. Thank you to the Chamber for sponsoring this event and for having me here. The department looks forward to continuing our work together.
Joanna, thank you very much. And a real debt of gratitude to the people at NCDOT. As Joanna indicated, I got to work very closely with DOT for almost 20 months as we were going through the NC First Commission. And what I'll tell you is when you do that, you get to be inside baseball for an extended period of time. These are very bright, very dedicated, very capable people. And the one blessing that we have at Martin Marietta, among others, is the ability to see how other DOTs work across the United States. We can take great pride in what NCDOT is doing. It's tough being a public servant because there are a lot of times you're going to pick up the newspaper and you're going to find yourself there. But I can tell you they are doing good work and shepherding the state's resources, in my view, quite well. So Joanna, thank you so much for that. Quick question as we get ready for this next dialogue. How many of you are native North Carolinians? Okay, that's a lot. How many have moved here from someplace else? Okay, that's still a lot. Here's what I would observe. When I left North Carolina to be in exile for 3 years in Texas, when we came back here in 2006, part of what I was taken by is North Carolina had become the 9th largest state by population in the US. That didn't feel like the North Carolina that a lot of us grew up in, and we can see what's happening to this state. It's exciting, it's going to be dynamic, and it's going to matter for a long time. If we're looking at demographic trends today, part of what we can see is by the time we get to 2030, which isn't going to be very long, we're going to be a considerably more populated state than we are here today. It's fascinating. If we're going back and looking at housing starts in the United States, here's some data to think about as we ready for the next conversation. If we look at where housing starts were in the United States in 2004, there were over 2 million housing starts. Last year, about 1.2 million housing starts. That's one of the reasons that we see such tightness in housing. But here's something worth knowing. There are about 30 million more people in the United States today than there were then. Now, that's a US number. We're growing in this state at a rate considerably faster than the US average. It gives you a great sense of why, when we start looking at Destination 2030, why that matters so much. So what I'd like to tell you is you're now going to hear from a panel today. You're going to hear from Gary Salamito, who is the President CEO of the North Carolina Chamber. You're going to hear from Joe Milazzo, the Executive Director of the Regional Transportation Alliance. And moderating that will be the former, our own from the NC Chamber, Jake Cashin, who left us and went to the Triad, who's now selling real estate in Kernersville, but we welcome him back to the Triangle nonetheless. So with that said, I invite you all up to talk about Destination 2030. Jake?
Thank you, Ward. Is this on?
Hello?
I need a new mugshot. I think that's on my list of things to do soon. It's so great to be back on the campus of the flagship University of North Carolina. Isn't that right, Ray? We all go to NC State. All right, let me get my glasses out so I can read here. Well, welcome to the North Carolina Chamber's annual transportation conference. Again, my name is Jake Cashin, and I am chair of Destination 2030, the road to a stronger transportation future. As Destination 2030 chair and on behalf of the coalition, I just want to thank you all for your support and your efforts over the last few years. We've come quite a distance, but we've got a long way to go. We have 167 coalition members to date, ranging from the smallest companies in North Carolina to some of the world's largest. We have many local chambers of commerce and many statewide organizations that are also a part of this coalition as well. Destination 2030 was created to help solve the state's growing transportation revenue challenge. This is not a coalition that is focused on the spend side of the equation. Our mission is to work to modernize and diversify the way we fund our state's transportation network. It is not a sexy issue, nor is it easy to talk about taxes, and that's not popular, but it's something that we as citizens must address to keep this great state moving forward. The North Carolina Chamber and Destination 2030 Coalition has been and is leading the discussion, and I'm happy to report that we're making positive progression. We're hopeful for positive outcomes in this upcoming short session as well. Just last week, on our last coalition call, Senator Vicky Sawyer announced she would be introducing legislation in the short session to help address some of these issues. If passed, this could be significant for the state of North Carolina. We're excited about what she's planning. So when called to action, please step up and help address this. This is about safety, strength, and economic security. Solutions to modernize and diversify must be durable, equitable, and competitive. So our formula is this: safety plus strength plus security times durability, equitability, and a competitive solution equals resiliency, vitality, and a growth for North Carolina. So today, we're happy to have a discussion with two great state leaders, Gary Salamito and Joe Milazzo. Gentlemen, you ready to get started?
So how about it?
Cool. So thanks to the leadership of many folks over the past decade or so, this state is on a trajectory of growth. North Carolina is a national leader in job growth, economic growth, and that's only becoming more evident with some of the announcements we've seen recently statewide. Understand there are many more economic development projects in the pipeline as well. But there's a lot of discussion with some of these announcements that the transportation network is sort of a key driver in the decisions to move here. What must we do to maintain this momentum from a transportation network perspective? And how do we go from being a good transportation state to a great transportation state?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Joe. It's good to be here today. I think we need to be bold and courageous from the very beginning. And we have good things going for us now here in North Carolina. We have people that are coming. They're going to come no matter what. They're on their way. So the time to make the investments is now. The time to make sure that we have choices is now. The time to be bold is now. So if we're going to remain competitive and be that top state for private sector job growth, which is the key to strengthening our communities, we have to be bold. We have to make the strategic investments in our roads, rails, water, ports, sewers, solid waste facilities. We have to look at creative and innovative ways to do that. We have to partner with the private sector and the public sector in ways perhaps we haven't done before. So it's there for the it's there for the taking. It's there for North Carolina to set and create a distinct competitive advantage, a sustainable competitive advantage for private sector job growth. But it's going to require some courageous decisions to diversify how we pay for it. And that needs to happen sooner rather than later. So we're asking our folks to have a bias for action and to be courageous because the time's now.
Yeah, first, I want to say thank you, Gary, to your leadership and Jake and everybody else, Mark, for the chamber, for the work that you have done, leading this organization, leading this topic. Joanne, I want to thank you and the folks at the department for everything that you have done. You continue to lead us well. We are blessed with that. And I'm going to build on everything that Gary said, agree with all that. We need a bias for action. That's absolutely clear. But I'll throw a couple of ideas out there as well. We need an element of communication and simplification, because when we focus on everything, nothing gets done. I actually thought one of the neatest things I saw was just about half an hour ago. Your video is terrific. Your video is just fantastic. Not just the headquarter in Raleigh, which I like that too, but the whole element of that, because it makes it visual, it elicits an emotional response, and it reminds you that we're about our future, we're about our families here. So that wasn't just a great video. Thank you for the sponsorship for this important thing, but there's an important message there, which is simplification and communication in what we do. So I know that Senator Sawyer's leading on some things, other members of the House and Senate are looking at things. We need to focus on one or two key things and get those across the finish line. That has to happen. And I know one of your questions, maybe some more specifically about one of those measures, are that we have a chance to move across there. Federal legislation was great. I would mention that. That was terrific. Okay, check that off the list for now. The state areas where we got to focus on some things. So I'll go back to you.
Great answers, guys. Appreciate that. As Joanna alluded to, and as everybody in this room probably is aware of, we do have a challenge with the motor fuels tax. It's just not in a sustainable position. But thankfully, thought leaders like you and many in this room are working to address that. But I think it is somewhat challenging. You mentioned a bias for action. Is it going to take a crisis in funding for the General Assembly and government leaders to act, and if so, does that create good or bad policy?
It's interesting, Jake. I would hope that it doesn't create a crisis to do it, because there are a number of different options. Our foundation did a study a number of years ago that listed a number of different ways, and it's not going to be one answer. There's not a silver bullet. There's not one way to fund it, to shift over from doing on gas. It's going to take a series of different things to do that, to get the revenues where they need to be. I would hope it wouldn't be a crisis. I would hope that we would be able to tackle these things one or two or three at a time and create a plan for sustainable revenue diversification. I think a crisis probably wouldn't get us the best policy. For example, suspending the gas tax is bad policy. Well, we got inflation now. Their dollars aren't going any further. We really don't need to suspend the gas tax now. We need to diversify the revenue so we're not so dependent on it, because we have to continue to maintain the roads and make sure the bridges are safe. And so, crisis in this particular instance, my guess is if I was putting any money on it, would get us worse policy than better policy. We need to lead from the front. And we also need to make sure that, the best time to change your game is when you're on top of your game, not when you're behind. And we're winning, so we should change it and stay winning.
So obviously this is a challenging one, because we've seen, and we can think of topics that have nothing to do with transportation lately, where when a crisis occurs, action does happen. I mean, the country always moves to action when crises occur. Part of what we need to do is try to paint a picture of what happens in the absence of action. In other words, not so much to manufacture crisis, but to help explain through vision, through visuals, and clear definitions exactly this is what happens if we don't act. That's not the easiest thing to do, but it can be done. The other way to do is more of an opportunity and say, here we have a chance to get ahead of an issue right now. One of the pieces that's out there, of course, and we're going to talk about, is electric vehicles. And this state was a leader on that already with the fair share fee that we've done years ago. That needs to be raised clearly for those. We have the opportunity to expand that further. And again, we'll talk more about that.
Great lead in, Joe. But North Carolina, as you mentioned, is a leader in attracting some of these electric vehicle type of companies. We're seeing some great announcements. The state has been able to position itself as a growth state to attract some of these type of companies. However, politically, does this put us in a difficult position to solve some of this looming transportation funding challenge? Or will it force us to come up with innovative ideas?
Start on this one, yeah. Again, we're blessed in a couple of ways here. We're not trying to create an electric vehicle fair share fee out of whole cloth, for example. That has been in existence. The only issue is it's not at the right level. And so it's not equivalent to what the average driver pays in their motor fuels taxes. So it's not a hard thing to say. They simply need to pay their fair share. There's no constituency for people to say, I want to pay less than my fair share. Nobody goes up and stands up for that. And so there's no reason to worry about that at some level to say, we're not trying to raise it. We're trying to make sure we're making it fair and equitable for that. RTA, as you know, is the position that says you raise the electric vehicle fee so it's equivalent to what the average driver pays, and then have everybody pay that same fee and then eliminate the state motor fuels tax. And then that just makes it all simple. Then you're more resilient long-term. Is that the solution? It could be. We've also been open to anything that gets us across the finish line. So part of simplification and communication is put a viable option out there. If it can get done, that's great. But as we all know, it doesn't matter what the solution is or who gets credit. It's getting the solution across the finish line.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much to add to that other than we have to address that because the growth is going to continue to come. And we already have more needs than we have resources. So we got to stabilize where we are now in order to have the maintenance to take care of the existing roads, because we don't have enough to do all the roads and the bridges that we need to build. So first of all, solve what you can solve, get the consistency in that so that you can make plans for all the other work we have to do as these 3 million people come here.
If I can add just something else, as we think about the various options, whether it's the EV fees, we talked about VMT fees, there's so many other options out there, and whatever one gets us across the finish line, that's the winning solution. Whatever that is, that's what we've got to do to get us ready for it. But we've talked for a while. I know, Jake, we've talked about this as well. In some ways, we do have to get not right with, but really think strategically about a question right now, because we look at all 50 states and nobody has obviously found that solution. If it would have been, we would have found that state, we'd have applauded them, and off we go, right? Right now, we've got to decide, is it a modernization issue or is it we don't have enough revenue issue? We all know the answer is both, right? We both need to modernize our pieces and we need to also raise the revenue. But we don't need to solve all the world's problems in the same month in the legislature. So it might be that the first thing is to modernize and get that pivoting over so then we can speak about it in a more revenue neutral fashion and they can be comfortable with that, while we're also looking for the other one, which again is if we don't mind if I can pivot to that just a second, is about the sales tax revenue modernization as well, because a great word for us on transportation is dedication. And not only the people dedicated to the profession, everybody here is, but dedicating transportation dollars for transportation purposes. That's a natural phrase. There's no one that would look at that and say, nah, let's move that over here. But right now, we don't do that. We have, when I'm trying to remember the number, Jake, I think it's like $11 billion in automobile-related purchases, $500 million in sales tax associated with that. That goes to the general fund. Those resources need to be, you could say, reclaimed or dedicated for transportation. I think one of the challenges we've got is that sometimes we use the phrase, we need to transfer that over. And that feels like, oh, transferring it away, it's taking. No. We're going to dedicate that for transportation, dedicating transportation dollars for transportation purposes. Because when we say it that way, which is both factual, it's important, but it's also very hard to argue against that. What is the constituency for not dedicating transportation dollars to transportation purposes? It's hard to argue for that. That's not going to solve all our problems. But if I remember the numbers that the chamber and others have put out, it's $500 million a year. That's a significant amount of revenue for this. So
Great point, Joe. And I think if you pay attention to the short session, you'll hear some of that type of language. Last week on the coalition call, Joe suggested to Senator Sawyer about how to use that type of language when she is selling this bill. And I think she really liked the information that he was sharing there with her.
I believe that was actually just out there. This is her idea and everybody's idea.
Well, I think it's a joint effort there. So, guys, with gas prices so high and inflation sticking around, more and more people are thinking about purchasing electric vehicles. Just 2 nights ago, a friend of mine was showing off his brand new Tesla, and I asked him, how much does he pay to drive on North Carolina's transportation network, and he said very little. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but we don't hear much about how these vehicles again contribute to the network as it relates to cost or revenues. Can you discuss some of the pros and cons about transitioning to electric vehicles and what that means for the network and the equitable part of that to our equation?
Yeah, just a little bit. We've been having some discussions. We were at Siemens last week for an event. And I think the question that continues to come up is it's really twofold. One, right? One is, okay, how are we going to make sure that electric vehicles pay their fair share? And Joe talked about that a little bit earlier. That's a key part. But then we got to work with our utility partners to say, are there chargers going to be out there? Can all these EVs, when they come on the grid, is the grid ready for it? Right? Because we're going to produce a whole lot of stuff. We got to modernize our grid also. And we've seen that, the opportunities, the challenges when we try to modernize the grid. We got to make sure our energy costs are competitive, that they're resilient, that they're diversified, but we have to modernize if we're going to be adding all these electric vehicles there. So it's really kind of twofold. And then the batteries, right? We're going to be producing some batteries here in North Carolina, really great project that was there, but a lot comes with that. Where are we going to get the raw materials? How are the supply chains ready for those? And we all know that supply chains now are being challenged. And the stuff that goes into those batteries, there's a lot of chemicals that goes into those batteries. So are the rail spurs and everything ready to get that together? So we can produce and say we're going to produce a lot of electric vehicles, but are we ready? I would suggest that a good long discussion with our utilities companies would suggest that they can be, but the grid has got to grow. The grid has got to be modernized to get there. So it's not as simple as, yes, I'm going to put a number out there. We're going to increase the number of electric vehicles and off we go. It's just not that simple.
Couldn't agree more with what you said. There's an article this morning that comes out from Wired magazine, or the online version. It also says that broken charging stations could be stalling the EV movement, which is an issue I wasn't aware of, that apparently some of the stations nationally aren't up to what they need to be. I don't know all the specifics about that, but that builds in the same point you're making about the maintenance of it, the supply chain of it as well. This feels like one area where we need some federal leadership on it. I mean, the federal government, we don't need them to do everything. We don't want them to do everything, but certain areas we do need some more national policies rather than having 50 states trying to figure things out. So one thing where it would be really helpful is to continue, and I know they're doing that, but supporting them on continued guidance for that. And then the other one is to make sure that we're ready for, we're going to be in both for a while. I mean, it's not going to turn a switch. We're going to be doing gasoline and diesel for a while, in addition to the EVs, and making sure, and how do you go through the transition for both of those? And I don't know that we have the answer for that, but we can't just be thinking it's going to happen as quick as we think or not as quick as we think. We got to be ready for both for a while from a seamless standpoint. Yeah.
Great answers. Joe, I'm going to start with you on this next one since you've kind of brought it up. And you guys at RTA have done an excellent job in thinking about things differently. But should we view the transportation network as sort of a utility? And if so, what does that look like from a revenue generation standpoint?
So, and I appreciate the question. So again, I mentioned earlier that we have been supporting RTA's voice the business community in the Research Triangle market here. We have been talking about an access user fee, or more specifically, a vehicle registration-based access user fee. And it really is along the lines of a utility. You can think of it like that. And to do that, or to get comfortable with that, or to get ready for that, we need to think about the network a little bit differently. So right now, how many people in here do not have a smartphone? Please stand up. Okay, right. So we all have that. So we're familiar with that. We pay, those of us, which is 100% of us, we have a smartphone and we pay a fee every month for that. Now, how many people's fee increases twice as much when you talk twice as many minutes? You stand up for that.
It's like the Eminem song.
I know, that's
Please
right.
Stand up.
Right. I mean, that's right. Well done, brother. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, what we're paying for our phone, obviously we 100% like them, so we must like the product, right? We liked it. But what we're really paying for is access to a reliable network. It's not twice as valuable when we happen to talk twice as much next month. It's not, or put another way, it's not half as valuable if we talk half as many minutes the next month. What NCDOT in particular is our lead partners here, what they have to do to prepare for a network every month and every year, day in, day out, is the operations, the maintenance. It's not like when we say, wasn't there like a pandemic and a lot of us didn't drive? Fortunately, the hurricanes and the storms knew not to show up during the pandemic. There was nothing they needed to do. That's not how it works, right? DOT still has to maintain our roads. Or if we all decide to drive less, they still have to make that reliable road network available to us 24/7, right? That's just, this is just statements of fact, right? So a utility about it at some level is, should we pay an access fee? Because what you're paying for is access to that network, and you could do it as a monthly fee. And if you do that, then it's sure easier to predict from the department standpoint. They know exactly how much they're going to get. It's easier for us as consumers to do it. Now, is that the right answer? That's obviously the simplest method. If you're thinking about it from a healthcare standpoint, that's called a capitation fee, right? Except it's a vehicle, and what the vehicle version of a capitation fee, that'd be the same thing. Obviously, you can modify that. You could tweak that in any number of ways, but at a basic level, that's it. If we think about transportation as a utility or as a subscription model, you could think of it like that. Then you start thinking about it in a way about its value to you. It's not so much the usage of the mileage, it's the value to you in terms of its access. And that's a very different product. Now, the video you saw, I'm not saying the video is aligned with that or even that's agreement for that, but whatever method we use, being able to think about what this network, what transportation does for you as a consumer, as in commerce, is going to be critical no matter what method we do. I will say that.
Anything to add, Gary?
No, those are the kind of innovative, creative ideas that we need to be talking about. And we need to get them all on the table and sort them out and figure out what works best for North Carolina. So it's really interesting. I mean, if we can figure out how to do those types of things better than other states, then we're going to win it. People are going to want to be here and jobs are going to come here because of that reliable, predictability, innovative way of paying for things that they know they can get raw materials into their facilities, they can get product out, and time is money, right? So if there's a predictable way for people to get back and forth and products to get in and out, and we've had an agreement and we're leading, companies are going to come.
If I could just add one more thing, that's the ultimate goal, right? We got to get that economic growth and sustainability, regardless what method we use. That's the outcome. We got to be talking about that a lot. And again, the reason why we're talking about a vehicle registration access fee as an example, it doesn't have to be the answer, but as an example about it is, we know that none of us can predict exactly how many EVs are going to be on the road 2 years, 5 years, 7 years from now. We can't predict when the next pandemic is going to happen. We can't predict how much vehicles we're going to travel. So we're trying to figure out how do we get out of all those games. And if we're paying a monthly fee, then it doesn't matter what the vehicle mix is, and it doesn't matter what the propulsion mix is, and it doesn't matter what the traffic mix is. You're going to know the same numbers all the time, and the department would be able to predict it. That's one of the reasons why. It's not because we know more, it's because in some ways, because we know less, because no one can predict those numbers. But one thing we do know is people are going to move here. One thing we do know is people are going to need infrastructure. What we do know is we need to maintain infrastructure. And what we do know is the less we're able to predict things, the worse the outcome is going to be. Those are known. So given focus on what the things that we know are, recognize where the unknowns are, mitigate the risk by getting a system that doesn't work for that standpoint. I mean, I will say this, the VMT thing, and again, RTA, we're going to support whatever gets us across finish line. Let there be no doubt about that, whatever it is. But one challenge with that is next pandemic, VMT drops again. And then what do we do? So now we're back to the same spot because we want to make sure we get great professionals at NCDOT and our municipalities, not just them, of course, the MPOs. We don't want to make their lives so challenging. They have enough to do as it is. This is hard enough as it is. Let's not make it any harder for them.
The big red numbers tell me I have about 7 minutes. Gary, I'm gonna start with you on this one, and it kind of comes off of something you said a little earlier. But if we do have a few minutes left, we can take the either finish early or we can have a question or two from the audience. But recently I received a flyer in the mail from someone running from Congress. One of their keys to success is to suspend the federal gas tax. But studies now disprove that to be the case as it relates to saving any money for the consumer. So with this issue becoming even more politicized, you've taught me many moons ago that politics and policy have to align to get anything accomplished. But is now a good time to have the discussion on the diversification and modernization of revenues, or even new and innovative ideas to help fund our transportation network?
Yeah, it is every year to continue to diversify and modernize how we do it. Suspending the gas tax right now will help you get through a primary and election, but it's not going to solve our transportation problems. Actually, it's going to send us in the other direction. So, we'll be very clear as an organization that whether it's here or whether it's federally, that's a bad idea. What we need to do is say, okay, how do we bring costs down to consumers? How do we continue to make investments of infrastructure? There's other tax policy questions you can ask for small to medium-sized businesses, which happen to be pass-through entities, as to how to get more cash in their pocket so that they can invest in their businesses. So the tax that pays for the roads to be safe and to be made so they can get back and forth to work, cut that so they can't get back and forth to work is easier. There's more repairs on cars, doesn't make any sense. If you want to put more money in their pocket, there's other discussions we can have. You know, let's get rid of the franchise tax that they're paying for all that equipment that is sitting there. Let's reduce the PIT because they're a pass-through entity and they've got 4 employees there. There's other ways that through tax policy, we put more money in small businesses' pockets without taking it away from the very network that they need in order to get back and forth to work and get their products to market.
Second, lower the personal income tax. Don't screw up the gas tax.
Well, are there any questions from the audience? I think our team will have a microphone available if there are. Going once.
I've got one thing I was going to mention while we're waiting. We can still
Sure.
take questions and so on. The Destination 2030 is not focused on the allocation side. It's more on the revenue diversification, but we can't lose sight of that part of it too, how that works. The department and also their partners at the municipal and regional level do need more flexibility in how they spend the resources and so on. And one of the pieces that would help would be operations. You mentioned maintenance as well, making sure there's sufficient funding for that long term, and also the ability to dedicate some of those resources that way. And Joanna mentioned value engineering. That's a great thing that the department's doing. It's not just saving money. It's also getting more product out sooner. And so they're going to be able to see more projects happening more quickly. That builds confidence in the competence. I mean, the competence is there, but it's not enough for that. People need to see the products. They need to see the projects moving forward so they can say, aha, that was happening here, that was happening here, that was happening here. This is what benefits look like. This is what success looks like. And one other thing I do want to mention is, I mean, we lead a metropolitan group, but we know there's 100 counties in this state. And not all 100 counties are successful right now, or successful as they could be. And transportation is an interesting thing. When you're in a congested market or when you're in a growing market, we all know why you need that. But when you're in a rural market, or you're in a rural market that wants to be able to tap into some of that prosperity, you need some of that accessibility. I mean, one obvious one to me, and this is an example, it's not the only one, is Interstate 87 from here to northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. That's the accessibility, one of the least prosperous currently portions of our state that has the opportunity to be more successful if we can just give them a little more accessibility. So we have to make sure that we're thinking about all the ways and how important those investments are.
Yeah, excellent point, Joe. Excellent point. So Ward, we'll get ready to turn this back over to you 3 minutes early. But if your company is not a member of Destination, I'm sorry, question. Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Good deal.
What's your question, Ward?
So when we have transportation infrastructure on a ballot, and people are voting whether they want to get infrastructure or not. So when transportation infrastructure is on the ballot, it passes somewhere between 87 and 90% of the time. So in other words, when people are voting and it matters to them, they'll typically vote for it. If we're thinking about what will need to be a long-term communications plan on why this is something that's important, and then coming back to your notion, Joe, keeping it simple, if you're going to have a communications plan, is really important. My sense is we're not going to have a single bullet that's going to cure this. It's probably going to be a series of bullets. So if we're looking at a series of bullets, say between 3 and 5, that we think are going to be vital in moving transportation funding to the right place, what do those 3 or 5 look like to you?
Yep. So if you don't mind me, just first of all, I agree with everything you said. I'll say what I would think the 3 to 5 would be, but it's important for us to come to as a consensus what those are and then go. It needs to be something that we figure out not just what they are, but when they are, because no one, not the public, no one can focus on a whole bunch of things all at once. So we need to figure out, like, what's the one thing we need to focus on now? And to me, that first thing in this state is dedicating transportation dollars for transportation purposes. That's something that can happen because it's just we have a surplus right now, and it's a time to do that, and it's a chance where that makes sense to people, particularly when the STIP came out. And now we can look at the numbers and see where we are. And here's a chance to make this better. Here's a chance to make things better. So that's number one you would do. Number two would probably be from the modernization standpoint. I mean, again, if it were from an RTA perspective, could we do a pilot just not for diesel, but just for gasoline for the vehicle user fee? Because that's the easiest one, because then it gets the truck situation out of the way. That's number two. Then you talk to your federal partners and you'd say, we need you to lead on EVs. We need you to lead on getting one national policy. And we keep repeating them over and over again. And then number four is maybe defense, which is nobody touches the gas tax until we go away from that completely. And then that's a top answer right now. The main thing is just to be thinking about what those are, when could we do, when they are, and go from there. So,
Yeah, and your work on the NC First highlighted a lot of good options, right? So it's just a matter of how you position that in the legislature now. I assume we have 18 seconds left. So I'm going to go ahead and end this segment. Oh, Gary, go ahead.
I won't take long. Just one thing I think we need to talk about too is we really need to look at public-private partnerships as a way. We've got more needs than we have time and resources to get there by the time these folks come. We visited the I-77 partners last week. If you've not been out there to take a look at that, I know there was a lot of stories around that when it got started, but they're running a heck of a project out there right now. That is a very impressive way to get people from one place to another with options. There's opportunities for more PPPs in this state, appropriately structured, working with partners along the way. It has to be an option for parts of the state and parts of communities. Some of the projects will not rank well on the STIP, whether it's the bridge in Wilmington or other places that require significant resources that just won't score high enough. We've got to make sure we're having a good, sound discussion about PPPs and looking at that cap.
Excellent point, Gary. Madam Secretary, thank you for your work and your partnership with NCDOT. We look forward to continuing to work with you all. If your company is not a member of Destination 2030, please let us know. We can get you signed up today. Mark, myself, or anyone on the team can do that. We just are looking to continue to grow out this coalition, build it out, and see some success moving forward. So thank you all for your time today.
Thank you.
Right, Gary, Joe, Jake, thank you all very much for that. One of the great debates that we were having across the country and in North Carolina over the last few years is really, what is infrastructure? We heard a lot of that as we were going through getting the hard infrastructure bill approved in November. And a lot of that was around the dialogue when there was a lot of debate around Build Back Better. One of the notions that I think we need to be sensitive to in the nation is how we're going to continue to grow and where we're going to continue to grow. There was a study that was done about a decade ago that was looking at population trends in the United States. And here's what it found. Between now and 2050, 75% of the population growth in the United States is going to occur in one of about 12 different mega regions. So what that tells us is we're going to continue to see population growth very focused in portions of the United States. As we pivot from that and look at North Carolina, we need to be sensitive too about where we're going to see population growth in this state over the next decade and beyond. So as we stand here today, or we watch this virtually, can we say with a degree of certainty that Wilmington, New Bern, the Triangle, the Triad, Charlotte, and Asheville will likely all continue to grow? I think the answer is we all feel like that's going to be certainly true. I think something that Joe said that's entirely right is there are portions of North Carolina that have simply not enjoyed the success that other parts of this state have as we've gone through different cycles. They haven't enjoyed the upside, and they probably suffered disproportionately in the downside. Part of what we were doing in the NC First Commission is we were looking at ways that we could see consistent, steady, and attractive growth across the state of North Carolina. That brought us to the notion that broadband was actually critically important. So when you think about infrastructure, in most instances, you're thinking about highways, bridges, roads, and streets, and hard infrastructure that moves you from point A to point B. When we think in particular about those parts of North Carolina that have not enjoyed the benefits of the economic growth this state has seen, we need to be thinking about those small towns, boroughs, and others that simply aren't seeing degrees of growth, but need to have high degrees of connectivity relative to education, healthcare, and otherwise, so we can have a rising tide that has the capacity to lift all boats in North Carolina. That's why this broadband conversation is so important. Here's something to think about. If we look at our education system across North Carolina, the single most populated college in the state is what? You may say NC State. Some may say Chapel Hill. I wish it was Duke, but it's not. The short answer is it's actually Wake Tech. It's right here. If we look at the community college system across the state during the last downturn, the community college system in North Carolina had nearly 900,000 people that were going to that community college system. At that point, that was modestly less than 10% of the population in North Carolina. That gives you a great sense of why broadband is so important. It gives you a great sense of why broadband in portions of this state, again, that have not enjoyed the fruits and benefits of economic cycles is critically important. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce Brian Gregory. Brian's the Vice President of State Government Affairs at Charter Communications. And Brian, we very much appreciate you being here. He's going to talk to us about some things that are important to his business, but important to our state. Brian, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? Thank you, Ward. We're talking about the information superhighway here. So broadband is infrastructure. How about a quick show of hands? Is there anybody in the room that does not have broadband at their house? See at least one or two, maybe three here. Okay, so that in a room of about 100 people, seeing that many is not surprising. I think it's a challenge getting into some of these rural areas. We could spend a whole conference on broadband deployment. We only have 15 minutes or they'll give me the hook here. So I'll do a real high level of charter, high level with what the state is doing to try to combat this, get to the areas that Ward is talking about and see if there's any questions. And if we run out of time, feel free to grab me afterwards. Again, I'm with Charter, also known as Spectrum. That's how we brand our products. We're a large company. You can throw a lot of numbers out there. We have 29 million customers across 41 states. The number that blows my mind is there's 450 million devices connected to our network nationwide. And you're going to see that increase exponentially as more and more things are added to that network. So that's all well and great for the company and the country, but we care about North Carolina. We're here. This is a major state for us. It's one of our top 5. We have almost 3 million customers here. So quite significant, almost 11,000 direct employees, major investments in capital, over 800 million in the last year, and connecting 127,000 people in the state of North Carolina just last year alone. We touch about 500 communities in the state. So we have a pretty broad reach. You can see on the map there, the darker blue areas are the areas that we currently service. Very proud to have won the U.S. News and World Report Best Rural Provider last year. We've really got to focus on rural broadband. We're certainly not the only company focusing on it, but it gets a lot of attention at our company. So when we talk about why people don't have broadband, there's generally 2 reasons. One is adoption, and the second is availability. We'll spend a little bit more on availability, but just for the background, adoption has the household adopted the product? And it could be something as simple as they don't have a device, they don't have a laptop, they don't have a tablet. Maybe they can't afford the monthly service. There could be a host of reasons. It could be that they just don't see the need for broadband, which is hard to believe in this day and age, but there are programs to deal with adoption. The federal government is throwing money at it. All the individual providers generally have low-cost services. We have one for $18 a month, unlimited usage. There are qualifying aspects to it. There's a new affordability program from the federal government called Affordable Connectivity Program. It's essentially a $30 credit for qualifying families to get high-speed broadband. If they get it from Spectrum, they can get 100 megabits, which is super fast. The FCC's definition is 25 megabits on the download speed. So there are programs out there. If you know of any people that would need this type of program, I'd be happy to connect you to the right information, but they could also go to Affordable Connectivity Program, and pretty much, again, all the providers in North Carolina belong to that. So the other big issue is availability. This tends to skew a little bit rural. It tends to find that more people that don't have the availability, the wired connection, or sometimes the wireless connection to their home, tends to be more in rural areas. That's because the cost. It costs a lot of money to deploy broadband. It could be $30,000 a mile if you're stringing fiber on a utility pole somewhere. It could be more than that if you're going to go underground and conduit and bore. It could be up to $60,000 per mile. So it's a lot of money, but we're putting a lot of money towards it, and the government's putting a lot of money toward it. I thought you might like to see a comparison from some of our neighbors here. You can see that we're probably the second in population. We're going to catch Georgia Ward eventually. And on the numbers, we're doing slightly better than everybody else. But then again, you see that in North Carolina, there's still roughly 472,000 people without broadband. Now, maybe some of them haven't adopted, but there's probably a large portion that can't get broadband at their house. So how are we going to get it to them? Keep in mind, these numbers are fluid. These are old FCC numbers. The tracking process, I won't bore you with all the details, but we're going into a more granular process with the FCC so they can track it a little bit better. But again, what are we going to do? So we've got federal programs. Charter is heavily involved in something called the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It was essentially a reverse auction nationwide. In North Carolina, we did very well. We applied and received $142 million worth of subsidies. That is for several counties, and that doesn't include our own private investment. Charter is going to put in at least $300 million to match that $142,000. And just to throw a little bit of numbers at you and to show that it's focused in these rural areas, we're going to be building in 38 of the 40 tier 1 counties. So those are the most economically challenged counties in the state. It's over 100,000 new locations that we're going to be going to. And essentially, it's more than half of the money is going to these tier 1 counties. And about 90% of the actual locations where we're building to is going to be in rural areas. And so this is one program. There are other federal programs out there. We'll talk about the state programs in a moment. There are other award winners for this RDOF plan in the state of North Carolina. And more money is coming from the federal government for other federal programs. So again, North Carolina, our leaders are doing a fairly good job of coming up with plans. And you look at the comparison again for the Southeast, we've had an established great grant program, growing rural economies with access to technology for a few years. We have made some major investments in it. And you can see when we're comparing ourselves again, we are a leader compared to our other states. Borrowed this slide from NCDIT, and it's just probably hard to read on here, but I'll just speak generally about the programs available. They put in, and when I say they, I'm talking about the legislature, an unprecedented amount of money. Almost $1 billion in infrastructure is going to these grant programs. They are focused on unserved areas, meaning that people that don't have the availability to get broadband at their house. It's defined by 25 and 3, again, which is 25 megabits by 3 megabits. If you can't get that at your house, you should be eligible in this program. And the way that it works is that the private companies typically apply for the money, and the Department of Information Technology Broadband Infrastructure Office has the grant program. So it started off as a little itty bitty $10 million program. Well, they supersized it this year. Applications are due next week on Wednesday, so we're very busy with that. They have over $350 million on the table from the state. Most of that is ARPA money. That is just the public money. That is not the private investment money that all the companies that are going to be applying are putting into that. Again, focused on these unserved areas. There's $100 million in a utility pole fund. Again, when we're connecting broadband into these rural areas, we find that there's a lot of poles in the rural areas, more poles than people. Sometimes the poles need to be replaced if they've been damaged through storms. Sometimes there's not enough clearance for safety reasons. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff on the poles and we need to switch those out. So that will help us deploy broadband faster. There's also $1 million that the legislature put in for new mapping, trying to make sure that we are looking for the places that need broadband the most and have more granular mapping so we know we can be efficient with these dollars. on top of the $350 million program that is due next week, the state is going to come behind it with another $400 million with completing access to broadband, or called CAB for short. This is an opportunity for counties to directly participate in the program. In this particular program, they will come to a private provider and say, hey, can you help us? We need broadband out here. They will be the applicant to the state with a private partner. And again, it is focused on these unserved areas. So, very exciting that this money is coming. And then there's another $90 million in what they're calling the stopgap solution, which is essentially another vehicle for the Broadband Infrastructure Office to find ways, again, to get these very remote areas. Obviously, it costs a lot, as we mentioned, to get fiber everywhere. Some places, it may be a wireless service. So they could take this $90 million fund, maybe put a tower up if it's out in the middle of nowhere, maybe near a state park or somewhere where it doesn't make sense to put fiber. So we'll have all these tools on the table. And then knowing that the federal government is going to be spending more for North Carolina. So on top of all this money that I've just talked about, we could see another $500 million coming from the federal government. So while money used to be an issue, we've got a lot of money coming now. Now it's time to spend it wisely. So how do we move together forward on that? Again, we talked about the money. There's a lot of money out there, but there's still a lot of process involved in doing it. We've got permitting. Joanna, we spend a lot of time with DOT and other folks in the rights of way. And keep in mind, this isn't just a Charter Spectrum thing. There's many other providers that are all doing this at the same time. So there's only so much room in the right of ways, as many of you know, so it gets to be a challenge. So we'll be convening stakeholder meetings. Would love to be involved with other companies and organizations here to try to make this whole process go faster. Some of the challenges that we face when we're deploying broadband, it just takes time. It takes time to go through the permitting process, make sure everything is going through safety, that we're not hitting other utilities when we're going underground, that we're observing whatever the safety rules are. It takes time to make our applications to get on utility poles, to change out those poles, to go through the grant programs. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask for a little bit of patience, not just for my company, but for the other companies that are also deploying here. But again, we have a tremendous opportunity in front of us. I think that we've got the financial resources, and I think that we've got good, smart leaders here and good organizations that are willing to work together and partner on these types of programs and making sure that we get this out efficiently. I know the Chamber radio team has been taking a lead also as well. The legislature preaching the importance of targeting these dollars to these unserved areas. And we're very pleased to take part in that. And so I wanted to leave just a couple minutes here to see if there were any questions or any other solutions. Great. Well, if anybody has recommendations for areas to target for the unserved areas, please see me and I can try to lead you in the right place. But I appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much for that. And one thing Brian put up on the data that's so important is he outlined where North Carolina was relative to our peer states. In rolling this out, he also showed very graphically where we were relative to other peer states with respect to population. And he outlined something that I know is entirely true. Georgia's modestly ahead of us in population. We will pass Georgia sooner rather than later in population. And as we head into about a 30-minute break that's going to give you a chance to network, here's something that I would like you to keep in mind. If you think about the way that Georgia has grown and the way that North Carolina has grown and why this conversation we're having today is so important, here's what I would ask you to keep in mind. If you're in Georgia, you have Atlanta, and then you have everything else. If you're in North Carolina, you have that march from east to west that I would submit is unlike any other state in the Southeast that we're competing with. We talked before about Wilmington and New Bern, the Triangle, the Triad, Charlotte, and Asheville. We talked about the spread of population and the vitality of our network and why we have to make sure highways, bridges, roads, and streets and broadband keep us connected in ways that other states aren't seeing right now, because we're going to have a level of growth that they simply won't. The other thing I would remind you is if you're recruiting people into different cities and different states, sometimes you're going to see people flocking in, sometimes you will see people deflecting away. One of the great challenges that Atlanta has had over the last decade is transportation has become so onerous in and around Atlanta, Fulton County, DeKalb, and the rest, that people don't want to live there. If we're looking at a visionary North Carolina and we're thinking about how we want to move people, goods, commerce, and ideas, this conversation we're having today is vital. And part of what you're going to have now is a gift that we haven't had in a couple of years, and that is about 30 minutes to actually sit and visit and talk together. So enjoy that opportunity. We're going to be back at 10:15, and we've got a great show for you as we finish the morning. Thank you so much. And if you will, please have a seat, and we will start the next series of sessions. Again, thank you all so much. I could tell by the volume in the room and the happiness that I saw between the groups. This was a well-received networking session. And again, so grateful to all of you for being here. I don't think it matters what form of business you're in today, whether it's heavy industry for professional services or otherwise. You've got supply chain issues, and you're seeing probably two discrete things that you're trying to navigate through. Number one, they're just more expensive. So inflation is just about every place. I think the notion that it was going to be transitory has now been dismissed. So that's certainly an issue relative to supply chain. The other issue relative to supply chain is not whether it's going to cost more, it's simply, can you get it? And that has a great potential to cause widespread disruption if we can't get goods. If we're paying more for them, that's one issue. If we can't get them, that has a wholly different matter that we need to navigate through. So now for our next session, we're going to hear future-proofing our trade and supply chain. So a very timely group. What we're going to hear from today will be Kevin Baker, who's the Executive Director at Piedmont Triad Airport Authority. We're going to hear from Brian Ostrander, the Senior Manager of Business Solutions and Optimization at the North Carolina Ports Authority. We're going to hear from Andrew Gantz, the VP Commercial and Strategy at Mallinckrodt. And moderating this today is going to be my friend Scott Saylor. Scott's currently counsel at Nexen Pruitt, but for years he ran the North Carolina Railroad Company with great skill and precision. So with that, Scott, over to you and the crew today.
Good morning again. My name is Scott Saylor, and pleased to moderate our panel this morning. We've got a great group of folks. I'm not going to have to do a lot of moderating because we've got really high energy and really a breadth of experience that I know you're going to enjoy. Supply chains have taken on an entirely new prominence in the last couple of months and really couple of years, I guess, considering COVID and other things that have been happening all around us. So we're going to venture into this topic a bit here with their perspectives, which are varied and broad. We're not only going to chat about what today looks like, but also what the future looks like for North Carolina to be competitive, as Jake was referring to earlier. We want to talk a lot about how we take the long view, what that really means, and what the needs are based on your experience. I took a quick look at the news this morning, and interesting. So GE, Ford, and Harley-Davidson all were sort of down, citing logistics and supply chain issues. GM up, because apparently GM has done a good job navigating all the supply chain, computer chip issues and things that companies have had. Facebook is up. Not sure how that relates to supply chain, but that was interesting. So we're going to start with Brian and just a quick intro on kind of what you do every day. And then once we do the quick introductions on that, Kevin's going to kick us off with a couple slides.
Well, thank you all. Brian Ostrander, Business Solutions and Optimization, which is a creative title for Jack of all trades, master of none. So I'm basically responsible for the carrier relationships for everybody doing the vessel or ocean going cargo, ultimately to the beneficial cargo owner or BCO, and all value-added programs in between. I come from 15 years previously well, first off, I'm a Catawba College graduate, so I'm proud that, this damn Yankee actually stayed south and ultimately was able to welcome myself into the community as well as ultimately to the businesses at hand. I worked for 15 years with Maersk Line, doing everything from supply chain management to customer service to vessel optimization and safety. So it was an easy choice to come to the ports of North Carolina.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Andrew Gauntz. I lead commercial business development strategy for Mallinckrodt, especially generics, which is about a $600-700 million generic company. We're the only vertically integrated US-based generic company left. I've been there about 3 years. Prior to that, had been in a couple of other companies, but the bulk of my career was with McKinsey & Company, where about 10 years I did supply chain, quality, and manufacturing turnarounds in about 20 to 30 pharmaceutical plants on 4 different continents. And I'm a proud Duke graduate and happy to be here in Raleigh.
So Kevin Baker with the Piedmont Triad Airport Authority. And I want to tell you all, first of all, we're getting on the screen here, it's the NFL draft. It's an early. So if you want to know anything about the NFL draft, we get early news coming on right here. So I am a graduate of Lehigh University, which funny, when I moved here 24 years ago, people would say, where did you go to college? And I'd say, they'd say, where do you go to school? And I'd say Lehigh. And they said, no, where'd you go to college? Because there's Lee high schools all over the place. Everybody assumed that's where I went to school until March 16th, 2012, whenever Lehigh beats Duke in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And now all of a sudden we're the darling of all Carolina fans in the state. But I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Started off as a consulting civil engineer. There's a lot of you in the audience. I work for the Michael Baker Corporation. No relation, my wife wishes. But took over at the airport in 2010 and have been there ever since. And we'll talk a little bit about the focus of the airport as we go along. So I won't dwell on that any further. And Scott, you want me to roll right into our stuff? So just an image of the airport. And look, for this topic today, we're sort of a provider in that supply chain and also a user in that supply chain. So a little bit unique. What do I mean by that? Number one, we've got FedEx, their Mid-Atlantic hub, which is their newest hub, probably the last hub that they're going to construct, that is on the airport. We're the biggest cargo moving airport in the state. And, as a result, that's a big piece of the logistics. The whole Triad region also very focused on logistics. For those of you who are around the area, you know that. And so we're an important part of that supply chain. But then there's the other half of the folks that are on our airport. Let me just advance and show you. Well, before I do that, let me just stay right here for 1 second. Notice some of the logistics that you can see around the airport right here. Surrounding the airport on all 4 sides are limited access freeways, 3 interstates. You're looking at I-73, I-840, and I-40. And if I backed out just a little bit from this image, you pick up 85, 74. There are interstates all over the place. We have some of the best interstate access really in the country, if you ask me. And then, of course, the airport in the center. And I just take a little bit of a look at the area north, right in the middle of the picture at the top of the screen, where you can see some dirt moving. That's the spot that we're going to focus on just a little bit here as we go along. But, on that other side, some of the users, there's FedEx. You can see FedEx, Honda, Hayco, VSC, Textron, and Boom. Those 6 employers right now are employing 4,600 people. And when you add Boom into that, once they're up and operating, that's another 2,000 people. So, our focus on the business of aerospace and aerospace design, maintenance, manufacture is really our focus going forward. We've got a mission. We've got 2 incredible commercial service airports in the state, Raleigh, Durham. And if any of them are here, you never heard me say any of this, right? But RDU is one of the most attractive airports, I think, in the entire country. Just a really well done terminal. Charlotte, one of the most efficiently run airport hubs, really in the world. And that's why American loves it so much. So these are great airports. I hate the fact, it really pisses me off that they steal so many of our passengers that will drive that way and drive this way. But look, we all work together, and our airport has that different piece of the mission.
2 days ago, 48 hours ago, I was sitting in our boardroom with a group of individuals who were from another aerospace company. There are 11 pursuits right now. And of those 11, I'm going to say 4 of them are just ridiculous ideas that will never happen. The middle 4 are probably 50% chance of happening. And then I'd give us, a 20% chance of being the winner if they happen. And then the top 3, I think we're going to get 2. And the third one is probably pretty close too. So we're with this group of people 48 hours ago. And I started off the conversation with them by saying, look, 10 years ago, a group of planners and engineers sat in this very same room, and we thought about everything that we needed to do so that whenever this meeting 48 hours ago happened, we'd be able to answer all of your questions affirmatively. Yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. Yeah, we have that. And that was what was so important about getting this place planned, so that companies like you see on the screen and a whole bunch of others that will be coming here in time have the ability to operate out of our airport. And this logistics piece, the supply chain piece, is so unbelievably important, because if you're Honda and you need to get products moved somewhere from somewhere in the state to here, their engines are made in Burlington. Those engines have to get moved from Burlington to our airport to be assembled onto an airplane. Other users bringing things in from the ports, and I'll tell you a story about the ports as we go along. But that supply chain is absolutely crucial to a lot of these users. Just to, again, kind of get you focused on where we're headed. Well, we seem to be frozen up. Can you advance me? There you go. So you can still see the colors from the other companies that I had listed there, but look to the north of the airport now, the area I asked you to focus on earlier. That's 1,000 acres of land that we have been developing over the last 10 years to have ready for any company that comes along and needs that kind of land. Let's see if I can move it now. Oh, see it now, we're working. There we go. It won't stop. Can you just move it backwards one? Okay, just zoning in a little bit on it. And I'm not going to focus on any of these companies, but you can see a couple of the various projects that we're looking at. The boom site is actually lower right center, sort of the triangle shape that you see, and then growing across the interstate. But what I really want to show you, this is just ruining all my fun. The area that you see here with the roads that are kind of, it's really hard to describe it, but you can see sort of a large rectangle area, right? Bounded by a couple of roads coming up to the left-hand side of the screen. Top of the screen is another road. You see the airport runway system on the right, upper right-hand side. And then the road that's coming out here. And I want you to focus down here on this water tower at the corner. That area is the 1,000 acres that I was showing you before in plan view. And just to give you a little bit of thud factor that I've already lost because of the clicker, but that is downtown Charlotte. For all of the Charlotteans out there, you'll recognize is it 277 is the Belk Expressway, I think, around the inner beltway. So if you just look at it back there and then here, you could fit the entire center city of Charlotte on this site. So, we have an awful lot of room to grow. I heard somebody saying, about drove me crazy. Somebody saying the other day, oh, well, they've got boom now. They got no more room. They're done. We have 1,000 acres. Boom took 65. We got plenty of room, just getting started. And just keep on watching us, because I think you're going to see a whole bunch more announcements coming up. And I think that, again, this logistics piece that we're here talking about today is absolutely crucial to it.
So let me tell you, I guess, a little bit, excuse me, a little bit about Mallinckrodt. We've been in Raleigh, and we're a user of the logistics that the rest of the team is going to describe since the 60s, the late 60s. We started production in the 70s of acetaminophen. So that's the active ingredient in Tylenol. There's over 600 products that include acetaminophen. As of today, we are the only manufacturing location for acetaminophen in the Americas or Europe. 80% of that material originates in China, except for our facility there in North Carolina, up Capitol Boulevard. We employ about 220 folks on 600 acres. We make about 25,000 metric tons of material a year, which we're striving to do, running 24/7. we actually have more demand right now than we can possibly supply, which creates some challenges I'll speak to. Just to give you a little sense of how my industry, the pharmaceutical industry, has been challenged by supply chain and logistics issues over the past year or two. Most of the supply chain for the pharmaceutical products we consume in this country is reliant on overseas sources. So the top left chart, you can see the pie chart, that 80% of the precursor material for acetaminophen originates in China, particularly in regions that have been shut down due to COVID. On the bottom, what the FDA has defined as essential medicines, those medicines essential for acute care, about 3 in 4 of those do not have any manufacturing location in the US. I believe that we're going to see further manufacturing growth in pharmaceuticals in this country. It may look different than the big factory that was built in the 60s, but it's likely to come back. The reason for that is the challenges throughout the supply chain. And I pulled just a bunch of headlines, kind of like Scott did. And we were talking earlier about another embargo announced for palm oil today or yesterday from Indonesia and Malaysia. Palm oil doesn't sound terribly exciting. It's being crowded out as costs go up due to the Ukraine crisis. Palm oil, however, is a feedstock to stearic acid and stearates. Mag stearate, calcium stearate are byproducts, or not byproducts, excipients rather, in nearly every tablet you've taken. So if you look at the back of your bottle, well, if Indonesia and Malaysia cut off palm oil, then that supply chain starts to get stressed and the ability to manufacture tablets gets constrained. During COVID, these challenges were exposed. India decided not to export any of its acetaminophen and 25 other APIs. China cut off supplies to India when India had its outbreak. We've seen drug shortages, we've seen patient risks, loss of revenue, and increased cost of healthcare. I think North Carolina is positioned to be a leader already in pharmaceutical manufacturing on the high-tech side. We see that throughout the triangle. I think there's further manufacturing likely coming. But the challenge, I think, to this chamber and to manufacturing and supply chain leaders is how do you solve some of those problems globally with good local solutions? Just to give you a scale of our little factory here on Capitol Boulevard, we have 15 rail cars a week coming into our factory. Frankly, they're congested. We could use a little help on that front. We ship to 100 customers. The number of customers who we ship to air freight has nearly doubled this year because of a global shortage of acetaminophen. The global shortage was precipitated when one of the Chinese suppliers shut its factory down, of all things for environmental reasons. They tried to restart their factory using old equipment and were shut down again by the Chinese government. Now they're still hoping to open in May. That might alleviate a shortage, but it's still going to be material coming from overseas, not our material. And so some of the challenges, I hope we get to talk through today in this panel are, how do we manage that? How do we manage relying on a global supply chain for pharmaceutical goods? And then more particularly, how do we in the manufacturing sector and pharmaceuticals leverage what we can to make it a strong sector vibrant in the US so we can be competitive? Raleigh in particular, that acreage we're sitting on is worth a whole lot of money because where we were in the country in 1968 is way inside the perimeter now. We're only a couple miles past the outside belt line, which is great, except we're going to lose our frontage when Capitol Boulevard gets expanded. We have rail congestion. We've got workforce challenges. We've got all kinds of other things we got to navigate, as do any other manufacturer coming into the region. And so we'd ask for your help trying to find ways to navigate through that. But let me pass to Brian to talk a little about how we get our goods from overseas.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'll actually go into a little bit about what North Carolina Ports is. If I can also work the clicker just as quickly as you could, Kevin, so thank you for that. What most people don't realize is North Carolina Ports actually has 3 ports. We have a deep water port in Wilmington, which is actually doing containerized and multi-use facility. We also have Morehead City, which is also a bulk facility, non-containerized. And then we also have a Charlotte Inland Port to help with the environmental concern on the short mileage to get into that market to help the western part of the state. It was originally designed for apparel and textile, but now since the supply chain crunch, we've actually seen a lot more verticals from e-commerce to even agri products actually moving on the supply chain. We do over 5,000 container gate moves per week. We do over 300,000 TEU or 20-foot equivalent units. That's how it's measured on the sea freight side. We do over 4 million tons of bulk cargo. So as you're talking about Andrew with trying to bring his raw goods in, he's bringing it in through Moorhead and shipping it out containerized through Port of Wilmington. We have over 1,000 ship calls annually, and we're also financially solvent. So we generate an annual revenue of 60 million, cash on hand 20 million, and 3 million in profit. So anything that's done towards infrastructure is exactly that. It's for paving, it's for cranes, it's for vessel maintenance, et cetera, where everything else is we actually have to come up with creative programs to support the labor on site, which we employ 220. So some of this was not possible until we actually did our capital improvement plan. This actually was a journey 6 years ago under Paul Koza, our former CEO. What we did is we did a berth expansion product to get us to 42 meters draft. As these larger vessels are coming in on the East Coast, you're actually a deterrent if you can't bring one of these big ones in to better supply either export commerce or import goods. We actually cleared the air draft, so we're 212 feet, which is similar to the Bayonne Bridge. So that's one less impediment. We're actually better than Charleston and Savannah as far as air draft. And our partners at Duke Power actually helped us with that. We have 3 post-Neo Panamax cranes. So those are cranes that can go 23 wide. So imagine a football field wide going across, and actually the Empire State Building going down. We actually work 4 cranes at any given time on one of these super Panamax vessels. We expanded the turning basin. So the big problem with these big vessels coming in, the river is only so wide. So we actually engineered a turning basin to allow that to do like a K-turn and come into port. We actually have done refrigerated capacity expansion because we see the demand of not only pharma within recent events, but also organic produce. So we're seeing a lot of demand for that coming in, which historically comes in through Philadelphia and Miami, to actually try to reduce its cost model to try to go over North Carolina ports. Our container yard expansion is currently underway. We're in the process of paving our last piece. About a month ago, we actually opened our new container office, and I'm happy to report our productivity did not suffer one bit. Let's talk about speed for just a second. All right, so you're hearing in the news that truckers can't get in and out of ports. It's taking upwards of 6 hours to get a guy in and out of the port. North Carolina Ports does it in 30 minutes for a dual transaction. So that's coming in, dropping off their goods, picking up an empty or picking up another export move. So we're built for speed, and we do it very safely and effectively. The gate complex is done. The terminal operating system is done. We're finishing our chassis yard. So we'll be able to twick in from a safety perspective of every chassis coming in and out. And then we are also conditionally authorized under the Water Act, the Water Resource Development Act, for a further deepening of the channel to be on par with Savannah. So what's this really mean? It means for exporters, you went from 10% of the global markets, you can now reach upwards of 30% of your global markets. So that's more areas that you can do business as North Carolina customers or even import from. So where is North Carolina Ports? We're actually set up as a very diverse type of area. We have the opportunity to grow vertically in a lot of our stuff. We have a network balance on the Trans-Pacific trades. We have a great partner in Independent Container Line, who is a time-definite European product that the pharmaceutical uses. At the same time, we're resilient. So even under COVID, our volumes grew, and we did not have any work shutdowns. So we had an effective operation model. We're a metrics-driven company. We were recognized by the Journal of Commerce as the best port for productivity on the East Coast, as well as we have multiple gateways that we can get product in. The best customer experience, because we all come in saying we're North Carolina. Our job is to help create jobs within the state. So we're going to continue to work hard to do that. And as well as we're built for smart growth. We don't build just to build. We build based upon what the customer requires. An example of that is Dole pineapples. So a lot of that cargo, again, was going through a Philadelphia gateway. They asked for a solution to go to the Food Lions and Harris Teeters of the world. So what they did is they actually asked us to help with their assistance and their product to build a chiller on facility. So we have an 8,000 square foot chiller that allows for any type of sorting as well as over the road.
All right, we're going to talk a few minutes with each of our panelists here. I want to ask a question though, Brian, before we go to Kevin.
Sure.
So when we read about all the ships, I've been reading about, sitting offshore and Los Angeles and that sort of thing. What was going on there? I've not been able to figure out exactly what that was. I thought maybe you could tell us.
Sure, that's like putting 10 pounds of cargo in a 5-pound bag. The infrastructure was not able to receive all that many vessels, as well as all the vessels were bunching. So bunching is the concept of, ultimately you're saying you have a 7-day window, but now you have all the vessels showing up at once. That ultimately caused a major fraction, not only in LA, which, is still about 90 vessels as of right now. But it also had a trickle-down effect where you saw these companies that historically moved over the West Coast shifting to the East Coast to diversify their supply chain. But what they do that? They did that in the very Southeast in Savannah and ultimately in New York, New Jersey, and that clogged them. So now you're starting to see other gateways that are ultimately impacted. Charleston also feeling the same thing with, I believe, 20 vessels off right now, still waiting for a berth. And ultimately, that's what's causing a lot of the problem. And a lot of it is based upon consumer trends have totally changed as well. The carrying capacity in a warehouse was, approximately under 10% right now, when historically is about 25 to 30%. So you're seeing everybody trying to get in front of the inflationary spend, as well as making sure they have enough carrying capacity to overcome that.
So my story is I have a Honda vehicle and it's sitting over at Leith Honda now. It's been there for 6 weeks waiting on a fuel pump because of supply chain logistics problems. It's probably sitting in one of those ships somewhere out there offshore. Well, let me go to Kevin. You've had a lot of major announcements, I know, in the Triad, Kevin, existing companies expanding and new ventures that have announced. You mentioned your boardroom. I met you in the boardroom on the first Toyota project. And Toyota was there. They had come from Georgetown, Kentucky to talk about the Randolph County site. It was a great meeting, and the amount of teamwork in that room I thought was phenomenal. And I think a question for you is talk about how that works from where you sit and how the infrastructure intensive projects that you've had, how has that played through in the Triad?
Yeah, and I've just got a great example that I want to share with all of you. And any of you who are in economic development out there, is this better, by the way, ladies? They were saying, hold the mic closer to your face. I thought she was going to get that big hook out and pull me off the stage. But, if you're in economic development, I mean, anytime you have one of these projects, these especially very large projects, it can get killed at any moment. I mean, you've got to be perfect on every single thing that they need. And if you can't name every tune that they want you to name, you lose. They go somewhere else. And with Boom, we had probably 5 or 6 times that I thought that we lost this thing. And, to a large extent, it was, saving victory from the jaws of defeat, the old line. But one such example really happened early on because they initially had a need to move very large components. They were going to manufacture the fuselage of the airplane elsewhere. And it would be shipped in, and it would have to be able to get from a port to the airport. And the dimensions of this thing are very big, over 80 feet long, over 32 feet wide. If you think about even an interstate, 2 12-foot lanes, a little bit of shoulder, maybe 30 feet clearance where all those, especially those old bridges, so getting that to work was going to be quite a challenge. And I called my 20-year-old friend, Mike Fox, and he's supposed to be here, I think, but I haven't seen him, and said, Mike, we need help. We need to figure this out. And we needed a connection to the ports, and we needed a connection to DOT for somebody who could help figure this out. And I'll tell you what, within 2 hours, I had 2 names. Within 3 hours, I had talked to both of these people. And this is at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. These conversations were happening. And the reaction that I got from both of these two was, we'll figure this out. Yeah, we'll figure this out. There's about 20 places where this isn't going to work, but we'll raise the bridge. We'll bring it around this way. We'll create a new pier in a river if we need to, in order to offload this thing in an area where it can then get on a road that will work. As it turns out, the ports figured out 2 separate ports that could work to bring it to the airport. You know, later on, the company told me that another state that we were in competition against, trying to clear this same hurdle, the DOT from that state said, sorry, we can't do this. There's no way. That was the attitude that the state traffic engineer took. It said, no, we can't do this. This can't happen. Our state, because of 2 individuals leading those 2 organizations, I should say 2 individuals plus all of their team, and this is the state traffic and the ports, they said, we'll figure this out. We'll get it done. And that attitude is exactly what we need to be able to do to win these companies, no matter where the project is, no matter what the need is. You know, especially on this logistics and supply side of things, we've got to be able to do what the customers need, or we lose, and you're out. It's that simple. And it could be, that's how tenuous these things could be. Just one person or 2 people getting involved in solving a problem wins the project. Think about how important that is, and think about how important it is, therefore, for our state to be prepared and to have people who are ready to say, yeah, we can do that, and roll up their sleeves and get it done. So thank you.
One other question, then we'll go to Andrew. When you're talking to companies and they're talking about their needs, the infrastructure needs, the transportation needs they have, in addition to the I guess oversized move you had there with Boom, what are the other tough questions you get from companies coming in that are kind of hard to answer, whether it relates to highway improvements or access to ports or FedEx or whatever? Any other lessons there?
Yeah, I mean, I think very often, especially the larger manufacturers, the ones who have larger airframes, they are looking for that port access. And that has been a challenge over the years. I'll just tell you, Scott, you and I were talking about a Boeing pursuit many years ago, 2 Boeing pursuits, the 787 and then the 777X. And, you know, they very much wanted to be near a port. But, you know, there's actually, there's a reason why a lot of those manufacturers want to be near a port. And it's an economic one, because they want to have the leverage over the other modes of transportation to make sure that they keep the pricing in line. Hey, railroad, trucking, if you guys can't keep the prices down, we're going to put it on a barge and then take it across the ocean. You know, so there's a number of reasons why, a lot of stuff behind the scenes that lead to the decisions and the needs of these companies. But rail access is another one. And Scott, you've been involved in helping us over the years with, you know, maybe getting rail access into the airport, creating a multimodal kind of facility in the airport for the offloading of big pieces, big components of airplanes that would then get shifted into an assembly line that is on the airport. You know, pretty important to most of the companies that we talk to. Honestly, with the road system, I mean, they just look at it and say, the roads are good. We don't need any help with that, because we just have an incredibly robust system of interstates around us. I used to make the comment that there's a couple of roads, and it's mainly because the loops aren't necessarily finished yet. They're just about finished, at least the one around Greensboro. And I used to make the comment that you could sit out on some of these roads in a rocking chair and not fear for your life most of the time, because they were so unused. And you could say, well, that's a very negative comment. No, it's a hugely positive comment. That is capacity. That's capacity for our future growth for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it's a huge asset to have.
Let's go to the life science front. Andrew, we all know about COVID and what it's meant. What do you think? Where do you think that's going now? Do you think these supply chain issues are going to I mean, it's in the paper literally every day still. What do you see there? Do you see solutions out there or not so much?
Yeah, COVID, I think, exposed the challenges in the supply chain broadly. And I don't think there's a unlearning of that. The president's budget has $40 billion towards the domestic strengthening of the domestic manufacturing basis for healthcare and life sciences broadly. So that's everything from the pharmaceuticals to the gloves to the masks. He's not going to get 40 billion, right? The president never gets his budget. But the prior president had the Make America Great Again, right? It's not going away no matter what party is administering it. And so I think the question ultimately is how much comes back? And can we rebuild what we're calling a critical mass of capabilities? If we were to have a conflict, we could not supply ourselves medicine if China were a party in that conflict, if India were a party in that conflict. I've seen 4 requests for material to the Ukraine, given the conflict over the last couple months, and vast majority of those materials cannot be supplied by American factories. I think that's a wake-up call. The Department of Defense called it a national security crisis. So I think there's enough momentum that this nation will need to rebuild some of those capabilities, some of those, I hate to say it, old school industrial looking capabilities, stuff in freight, stuff on rail, stuff where it's maybe not the easiest job to do day in, day out. We were talking earlier, we've got guys moving totes of material in the North Carolina summer outside. It's hard to find folks willing to do that nowadays, anywhere. But I think those jobs and those factories will be coming back. I don't think we'll be entirely self-sufficient as a nation, right? That's an unachievable goal. However, I think there's enough political motivation and certainly capability in this country to bring that back. I just think it's a question of, is there a time to get it done? Can we move fast enough? Can we capitalize on the current sentiment? And ultimately then who's going to win? Which state, what region is going to capitalize on that? Our headquarters for part of our subsidiaries in Missouri, that budget in Missouri this year is putting a couple $1 million towards advanced manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredient. Is that the type of thing states are going to compete over? Is the federal government going to play a role? I think that's still to be determined.
One specific question, coming back to Mallinckrodt, how did you all get to a place where you're the only provider of acetaminophen in the Americas, if I heard that right?
That's correct.
How does that happen?
It's hard to keep a factory open nowadays. And that's the simplest way to put it. A lot of factories have closed. We've lost 10% since 2013 of our active pharmaceutical ingredient factories as a country. Of the 100 or so factories that are large scale chemical plants making active ingredients globally, there are 4 in the US. And as of a couple of years from now, there'll be 3. And so that's just the reality of economics, globalization. And admittedly, I was with McKinsey driving some of this, so I own it. But globalization, chase the least cost solution. When India and China are subsidizing manufacturing and holding different environmental standards, holding different labor rates, offering special economic zones, they win. And when China has a 25-year strategy to do so, they're good at that, and I credit them. Is this country willing to make that type of investment? I'd argue we have to. We don't have a choice. And obviously that's beneficial to me as a person in the pharmaceutical sector, but I think it's also the reality of the world we're going into. We aren't going to reverse globalization, but I think nations are realizing the need to have their own capabilities, even if they're big, old, ugly chemical plants. And I think that's going to rely on infrastructure, doing it right, technology, public-private partnerships to make it happen. And as for the acetaminophen plant, to be honest, we've just fought like hell. Sometimes that's just what it takes. We've probably been on the chopping block or the risk of being shut down 5-6 times in our 60-year history. And that's just the reality of it, a commodity business. But we have a blue chip customer base. I guarantee everybody in this room has taken a product containing made in North Carolina acetaminophen, knowing our customer base.
Fascinating. We're going to talk to Brian in a few minutes more about ports, and I think we may have a few minutes to open it up for Q&A. I'll leave it to you all to tell me if we have enough time for that in just a minute. This morning, I live in Apex. We moved there a couple of years ago, and I was taking a 20-minute walk this morning and thinking about this panel. And I looked around and I said, we've got railroad, we've got city streets, we've got water from Jordan Lake, we've got US 1 that's a 4-lane divided highway. None of those infrastructure projects has been touched in 25 years. I mean, we're lucky that it's all there. And so I keep thinking, okay, was I told Mark the other night, what's the next big thing in infrastructure for our state? What does that look like? What are the policies that have to come in around that? And the port case, and I know for the railroads, super capital intensive. Talk to us about how long it takes to plan your infrastructure and how far ahead you have to think. And then you've got to deal with Corps of Engineers, and you've got permitting, and then you've got, all the things that go into it.
So if we just start talking about like the channel deepening project, that is at least a 9-year life cycle. So you have at least a year of lobbying of why this is important to the economics, the environmental impact study. Then you also have the cost benefit analysis. All of that needs to be handled before it actually goes in for review. Then ultimately the resources are stretched at the Army Corps of Engineers. So you have to plan all the way through, and actually I have to anticipate now, what are the vessels going to look like 10 years from now? Are we going to be bringing in 23,000 TEU vessels, which are actually mostly used on the Asia-Europe trades because of the heavy deep water ports? But these carriers are all looking for economy of scale. So they want these ultra large vessels to come in because they can get more moves and ultimately pass that savings down onto the customer. So it takes us every bit of 10 years and having a lot of forward thinking, and then all while hoping that you don't get another crash, that ultimately you can still support and fill these vessels. So it's to the McKenzieism of the globalization and ultimately these carriers going into a consolidated model, you really have to forecast every one of those pieces of variable prior to even offering it for an environmental impact study.
So if you've got a 9-year horizon, when do you have to know that when do you have to have the money in the bank for that? What part of that phase, or does it just happen along the way?
It usually happens along the way. Some of it we will do based upon self-funding, based upon either we need to make sure that the maintenance is there. We ultimately have different opportunities to do so. But typically what we'll do is we'll target some of the smaller vessels as opposed to one of those ultra large vessels first, because we're already at a disadvantage with that draft. So if we say to a state that ultimately you're going to be able to pass on, freight rates were alluded to of $23,000 for Pacific right now when they were $2,000 a year and a half ago. So looking at that comparison, you have to make sure that either the private partner is going to ultimately be able to fund that, or ultimately that if we want to pass this on to the consumers to actually have a reduced cost product, they're going to have to invest in the infrastructure.
Backs up through the chain. Yeah.
Let me comment on that if you don't mind. On that point about increased freight cost. Freight costs may be elevated for quite some time. Well, that hurts that competitiveness from Asia against the US. So the mindset's always been, well, it's more expensive to make it in the US. That's becoming less and less a gap as exactly what you're describing, Brian's occurring.
Detailed question, then we'll go to Q&A. I think we've got a few more minutes here. I see large tubes coming into Port of Morehead City, and somebody told me those were windmill parts. Is that right?
That can neither be confirmed nor denied.
Okay. Proprietary, I understand.
Yes. But yes, you're seeing a lot of the manufacturing products actually go back through Morehead City. One of the examples we talked about when we were just chatting was, the Ukraine coming up and ultimately being able to supply the steel for the railroads. All right, so that's typically something that is coming from the Ukraine. It was usually going directly to Morehead City to ultimately supply the Norfolk Southern. Now that is totally disrupted. Now what we're seeing is actually, because the barrier of entry has changed, the cost and freight rates have changed so much, you see Australian steel actually coming into the market. It couldn't be any further from the East Coast in reality, but what you're seeing is people are getting creative with it. You're seeing that the market driving it is allowing that to happen, that the freight cost can be absorbed through the product itself that way.
There you go. Great explanation. All right. Do we have any questions? Anybody? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all three for preparing for today and being here. Appreciate it. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
Scott, thank you all so much for that dialogue. I think it's worth thinking about several things that we heard and how it ties into the broader conversation we're having today. We heard a lot about air, water, and we heard about drugs. And the fact is, those are three categories that, as we look not just to the present of North Carolina, but the future, that'll be incredibly important. One thing that I think we need to recognize, and that is, in the United States 50 years ago, we made things. We had great ideas and we made things. Today, we have great ideas. We don't make as many things. Part of what we're going to have to do in this nation, I think part of what North Carolina can fill a needed void on, is we're going to have to return to the business of making things in the United States. It's going to be an economic imperative. It's also going to be a national security imperative. And if we think about some of the differences that we have, we can bring things in, as we heard, by air, by rail, and by water. Most states don't have those different privileges. What we need to keep in mind too is anything that happens in places like Panama, think about the notion of widening the Panama Canal, having much larger Panamax vessels that can go through that canal, that will find their way to Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, New Bern, Virginia, or the Northeast. And then suddenly we come back to this notion of how much time do we have to make sure we're in a position that we can bring these larger ships that need a considerably deeper berth into these ports. Again, if we're looking at remanufacturing in portions of the state of North Carolina that have not benefited through the previous cycles, these are things that we need to be thinking about now, because the funding mechanisms for those into the future is going to be incredibly important. And that's in large measure what this next panel is going to talk to us about. We're going to hear about a forward-focused look at infrastructure. Please do not hold back any questions that you may have. I'm pleased to introduce J.J. Eden, the Executive Director at the North Carolina Turnpike Authority, Deepesh Nair, the Head of E-Mobility and Business Leader at Gilbarco Vita Route, Denise Turner Roth, the President of U.S. Advisory Services and the Senior Vice President at WSP USA, and moderating will be Pam Townsend, Senior Vice President and Southeast Regional Business Manager, also at WSP. So the panel is yours. Thank you so much.
About now. Thank you. Well, good morning and welcome to our future focused look at infrastructure panel. I am proud to be a North Carolina Chamber board member. I'm with WSP and a consultant with WSP. Our esteemed panel with us today will help answer the question for you: what do we not know that we need to know about the future of transportation and infrastructure? So, looking at the demographics of this audience, I'm assuming that most of you remember, or at least saw on reruns, the Jetsons cartoon show. When we think about transportation of the future, the Jetsons flying family car may come to mind, or that may be pretty cliche by now. But did you know that George Jetson, the father, was born in 2022, this year? I heard this factoid last week in a meeting, and it really did hit me. The future is here and now. I have a granddaughter who was born this year, and it is amazing to consider that she will experience the Jetsons fantasy infrastructure world of the future, which is actually coming true today. We all sense that we are living through a great transformation. We are looking at the choices we are making, evaluating how we spend our time, what is important to us. All of those different choices will impact in some way, as we've heard this morning, the infrastructure needs of the future. Fundamental technologies coming online will reshape the future, and some of these technologies will take major transitions to become mainstream. Our panelists today will help to identify these technologies, considerations, transitions, funding, and how we predict the future, all in 45 minutes. So let me introduce the team, and their bios are very important to this discussion. Denise Turner Roth serves as the president of advisory services for the U.S. region of WSP. The U.S. Advisory Services consists of 500 industry-leading professionals supporting C-suite executives. The group's expertise is in providing research and development, planning, asset management, grants, and project finance service offerings to clients across key infrastructure industries, which include transportation, energy, buildings, water, and environment. Ms. Roth also brings extensive experience in technology transformation, public-private partnerships, property portfolio management, and economic development. J.J. Eden is the executive director with the North Carolina Turnpike Authority and has more than 50 years of leadership and experience in the tolling industry. NCTA is one of the nation's most advanced transportation agencies and is building infrastructure capable of meeting the demands of a changing economy. JJ serves on the boards of the International Bridge Tunnel and Turnpike Association, the Omni Air Consortium, and is a founding member of the executive board of the Easy Pass Interagency Group. He is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Toll Innovation. And rounding out the panel is Deepesh Nayanar. Deepesh leads e-mobility North America for Gilbarco Vita Route, a transportation technology company of Vontier, and he's based in Greensboro. Deepesh is using his experience to advance EV charging technology into the mainstream retail, fuel, fleet, and C-store markets. Deepesh has 20 years of experience in highly technical industrial technology and automotive vehicle-based businesses. Prior to joining Gilbarco Vita Route, Deepesh led marketing and product management for the connected vehicle business at Navistar. So I'm going to turn to Denise to set us up. What are the emerging drivers for the infrastructure framework of the future? And Denise, how do we predict the future?
Well, if I could really predict the future, I'd get to have a lot of money right now and sit here with all of you. But thank you for having me here, Pam. And Pam didn't say that I also live in Greensboro, which is one of the important parts of my bio as well. And I appreciate the context from which we're starting, right? So this morning, we've heard some very important discussions that really does set the context from where we're living, where we are today. One of the aspects when we think about Greensboro and some of the things that Kevin pointed to, and just to give that full context, it's been about $2 billion worth of investments since December in the area. And that's probably a small number, but that is very significant. And that's not even the announcements that we've heard across the state, from the Triad to Charlotte to Fayetteville, just significant amount of investment that is happening from the private sector for our state. You couple that with the infrastructure funding, which at this stage, we are still looking at ARPA dollars that are coming to the state and not quite at the point of the investment dollars that are coming through discretionary grants and other opportunities to the state as well. And then we add to that the point that was made with the last panel as well, is that we have strong infrastructure, right? And we have a strong physical infrastructure, certainly, that has been quite a bit of investment over time in ensuring that we had roads and highways that continue to make us a gateway of the South. And so you bring that together as we start to look at trends, and we've had a great opportunity at WSP. We had the opportunity to work with NCDOT in developing the NC Moves 2050. And with that, we looked at a number of trends that are happening in the state to really get to those drivers. Some of the areas certainly that we can't help but think about is what is happening with our people. People are certainly choosing to live differently. We're seeing an increase in our urban centers, and we'll expect to see more of that increase happen more rapidly with the announcement of these investments. It could mean that people live closer and closer and more density, and what that means for us from a mobility standpoint. Not only are people looking to cars and will look to cars into the future, but they'll also look at bikes and car sharing. And you'll hear more from, as we talk as a panel, around what that will bring from a technology standpoint, as well as from an investment need standpoint. It also means that we have to ensure that our infrastructure remains able to take care of and meet the demands that will increase rapidly as well, that we're able to really sustain the level of vehicle traffic that will happen and the increased passenger activity that will happen. One of the stats that I remember in particular is 70% of the people in the state live within 30 miles of a passenger rail. What could that mean for rail in the future? How will we use that differently to access work, to access play? Our tourism increasing. We have great sites and great opportunities in the state to really explore it. Will that mean more people coming to our state? That's what we're predicting if we're actually going to predict some. And then we look at the areas of like climate change, right? We've seen more extreme weathers happening on some ends as well. And we've seen the increase of tornadoes. We've seen increased flooding. That certainly can come when you have greater construction that's happening, which should happen. We should expect to have more suppliers that are needing space for development in order to serve. But it also means a workforce opportunity for training more people and for training them for new jobs or for advanced manufacturing, for research, and being able to bring more into our ranks overall. So there's a great span, Pam, that we look at from a people standpoint in terms of how they live, work, and play, from a business standpoint of how they're operating and what they use from an infrastructure standpoint, and then obviously from a technology standpoint. And we haven't begun to talk as much about the impact on our utilities and how there will be an expected increase. And I'm sure our energy companies are thinking about that regularly. But also the impact on broadband and the greater need and access with the more connected activity that's happening, not only with vehicles, but just how we connect overall. It does mean that we need to be able to depend and rely on the access to technology, which will mean a greater impact on our utilities as well. And I'm sure we'll get into discussions around the use of data and the access of data and being able to maintain that data, certainly. So there's quite a bit that we can go on and on, but I do think it's an exciting time. There are a number of elements that we have to balance, but I do also think that we're very much up for. The great part is that we have been planning for that day. You know, I was city manager of Greensboro way back when, and even then was working on the funding for the mega site as a key part of my daily activities. And to come back home and to see that activity actually at play, I know that we have been preparing for this moment. So I'm very excited for where we are and look forward to more discussions.
That's awesome. Thank you, Denise. So JJ, you have a passion for technology. I know that. What do you see as the important innovations of the future, and how does the public sector transition to them?
Well, I'm going to show you a video in a minute, but I want to just set this up a little bit and think about what your average drive at a night out is right now, right? And, you know, a couple of years ago, I was a judge at the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas. And one of the things I learned at that point, it was just when Alexa and everything was coming together, that we're starting to see a merger between the consumer electronics side and, you know, the car companies and everything else used to be the commercial side that really didn't talk to each other. Same thing with highways and transit and other more modes of transportation. So think about that drive as you watch this video. Can you run it?
What's the quickest way to Yuriko's house?
10 minutes via the freeway.
Perfect.
Low fuel. Would you like to get gas?
Let's make it quick.
$37 to fill up.
Fill up.
Okay, rerouting now. Fill up at pump 6.
I need coffee. Take us to the nearest coffee shop.
There's a coffee shop nearby.
Order 4 large coffees.
Okay, your total is $12.
Pay now. Hey. Ooh, where are we gonna park? Find available parking.
There's a garage nearby. Spot 268 is available. Redeem points for VIP passes.
But look at all the connected technology in there. Look at all the connected businesses in there. Did anybody ever think that would happen? I mean, how many people right now thinks we're going to see this in the next 3 years? They're launching this year, Sirius XM. And I'm not endorsing them because there's 18 other companies. Every car company is launched connected vehicle. Actually, right now, who has a car that has an app that can unlock their car or lock it? A lot of people. Your car is connected. So last year during the pandemic, we looked at where's our traffic going, and we're going to put counters out there or people out there to count. We just went to connect the vehicle, and we looked to see where people were driving and how the commuting has changed. A lot of things are happening in this market. The technology in there, I just talked to somebody who was on a cruise, and when they got off, you used to have to show your documentation on and off. They're using Face ID. The technology in there, they use retina scans, they use fingerprint IDs, they use all that. So the business models are different than all these technologies you saw them use. The business model in tolling is way different than parking. It's way different than fast food, or they showed a coffee shop. So they're launching it in pieces. You're going to see it in pieces as it comes about. You talked about data. When we started looking at a connected vehicle, we looked at, geez, all we have to do is look at, basically origin destination. And then they came up with like 16 pages of what comes out of a computer, out of a car that's constantly streaming. Every 3 seconds it updates. And we're like, wow. And then the normal thing for people to do is they look at this data and go, we could use that, we could use that, we could use that. And it's too big. It's petabytes of data. So we looked at where to store it, right? What do we do with that? We're government. We don't have big servers. And then once you store it, what do you do with it? How do you do analytics on it? How do you figure out what you really need out of this stuff? It's a challenge moving forward, but this is going to open up a lot of different fronts. Just the technology in here, again, it will allow us to fund more infrastructure. Tolling went from toll booths with $100 million toll plazas, taking acres and acres of real estate, to gantries. When we did that, everybody said, that's not going to work. The leakage, people aren't going to pay. There is some leakage. We build it in the finance model, right? And it's working. The next phase won't have gantries. If you want to put a geofencing area for an event, to charge for parking that will include a lot of stuff, or just access, you'll be able to do it. So you'll be able to fund a lot of different types of infrastructure doing this. You'll be able to really move forward with a lot of things. The technology I've been trying to keep up with it for 50 years. And it's just moving forward and forward. We've been looking at transit systems for a long time, and connecting it, transit and tolling and ports and aviation and all that. I read this morning about vertiports. The governor said that we were first in flight. We're going to be next in flight. So vertiports are starting to be developed. How do we integrate that into our transportation systems? I work on the highway side. We try to make the best highway and the best customer service on that side. We're looking at artificial intelligence to use on our phone systems and things as people call in. We're looking at all kinds of advanced technologies to make things better, more economic, so we could put more money into the infrastructure. And we're going to continue to do that as we move, to more technology. Typically in government, we always looked at what we did and tried to replicate it. So as Pam mentioned, I was a founder of EasyPass. And if you look at EasyPass, we just copied what a ticket system would look like. There was no innovation there except we moved the medium. Today, we're not doing that. Today, we're looking at why are we doing this? Who's doing something better? What's Amazon doing? What's Google doing? What's Apple doing? And why can't we do what they're doing? And how do we take our systems and make them more of a platform than a system? How do we move forward and be able to implement any technologies that we need to make things better for our public, to make things better for people to commute? Tolling is not the answer for everything. It may be an answer for some things, but it's a combination of systems that we bring together. We heard from the ports, we work together because a lot of times they used our roads to come out, right, in different states. So aviation, the same thing. We have to work together in making this happen. We have to be demographically aware. We're looking at, not everybody can pay for what we used to be called Lexus lanes on that side. Not everybody can pay for that. So how do we make it so it's affordable to everybody? How do we make it so everybody can utilize our systems, whether they're highways or air taxis or whatever? So technology, I think, used correctly and analyzed correctly and picked correctly can really help us move our infrastructure needs and our commuting needs into the future.
Excellent. Thank you for that glimpse of the future, JJ. Moving on to Deepash. As a leader of e-mobility, you are on the ground level for the journey of transitioning from fossil fuels to EV. Can you please share with us today the good, the bad, and the ugly of what you're experiencing?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me here. I'm very happy to be in this audience or with this audience. Quickly about Vontier and Gilbarco Veeder-Root. So Vontier is a pretty young company. We separated out of Fortive, which was part of Danaher previously. Vontier is currently headquartered here in Raleigh, and it employs about 8,800 people worldwide. I'm part of Gilbarco Veeder-Root, which is one of the largest operating companies of Vontier, and we're based in Greensboro. So we're in a very interesting position because Gilbarco Veeder-Root has been in the business of fueling for 155 years. I'm not sure what we were fueling 155 years ago, but we've been around that long. But about 4 or 5 years ago, actually 15 years ago, we realized that electrification is happening. 5 years ago, we took it really seriously and we realized there's a lot of it that's going to happen and it's imminent. And in 2017, we started our journey with electrification. So, pretty interesting perspective given majority of our business is still fossil fuel based, but we recognize there is a need, a challenge, and an opportunity getting into electrification. So today, we have a platform of services that includes hardware, software, and other infrastructure solutions for our customers to make this transition. Now, coming back to your question around good, bad, and ugly, I think there's a lot of good. First of all, I think we all recognize, I know there are people potentially on two sides of the fence here, but, climate change is happening or not, but let's assume it is happening. And in the event it's happening, we've got to create a cleaner world. So vehicles have got much better. Fossil fuel vehicles, emissions have reduced, and it's been improving a lot over the last 15, 20 years. But battery electric vehicle solutions and hydrogen and other such forms do allow you to get to a much cleaner environment. So I think that is the good. The other good is, 4 or 5 years ago, we were wondering, electric vehicles were about 1% of the population. The big question was, what's it going to get to? We have all kinds of projections. We believe by 2030, it could be, 30% of vehicles that would be sold would be electric. And we said the tipping point would be 2022, when we're really going to see, a sudden surge, much more growth in EV adoption here in the US. And, I said, any prediction is always going to be false, but I was proved wrong. And here it's 2022, I feel we are at the inflection point. The adoption of EVs has really taken off. If you're just sitting and watching commercials, a single day doesn't go by when I've not seen a new EV commercial, whereas it was a year and a half 2 years ago, Super Bowl was the first time I saw an EV commercial. I think it was the Audi e-tron that showed up. But now it's like every other commercial feels like an EV, maybe because I'm in the industry and it feels that way. So the big inhibitor has always been price, choice, and range. And if you look at the cars that are coming out, price is not fully there yet, but it's much better. Choice, you can all see the number of vehicles that are out. Was only a Tesla before. Now you've got, the GMs, the Fords, the Hyundais, Kias, Volvo, everyone out with electric vehicles. So consumer choice has increased. Price is almost getting there. The cost of producing these cars have come down. Battery costs were, I think they've come down. They were like $1,000 per kilowatt hour, maybe 10, 12 years ago. Now it's approaching 100 or even sub, which makes it pretty close to being able to manufacture cars, at par with fossil fuels, EVs at par with fossil fuels. So I think those are all good things, given that the overarching goal is to drive a cleaner environment, drive adoption of EVs. And I think this kind of is the good news there. Consumer sentiment has also improved. So, if you look at surveys out there of, do people want to buy EVs? A lot of new car buyers are interested. I think the stat is somewhere around 64% of new car buyers. And of course, you'll have different surveys out there that want to buy EVs. And the proof, I think, is what I read just maybe 3 days ago. Q1 2022, we sold 2x the number of EVs than the same quarter last year. And the US is at 5%, where we've been 2 to 3%. And Europe has already taken off, as many of you guys may know. China is the #1 in EV adoption. So I think it's critical in the new age competitive set also for us to be leading on this front. Now there's a lot of bad and ugly, but I wanted to give you guys the good first to get the room a little happier. But I have a slide that can walk you through it. So this is some of the research. So we engage with, primarily Gilbarco Veeder-Root deals with gas stations and C-stores. That's most of our customers. 60% of gas stations in the US use Gilbarco product. So we understand the driver behavior, et cetera, pretty well. We also sell to fleets. But this is our research with EV drivers and our customers who want to get to electrification. So one of the big challenges you'll see is, many companies put out either it's mandates or strategic intent to say, yes, we want to electrify. And then there's someone identified in a company, maybe someone like me, like how I was 4 or 5 years ago. Hey, go and figure this stuff out, right? And that's a great mandate to be given. But the minute someone gets into that role and tries to understand, how do I do this, whether you're a fleet or a C-store chain, what's my first step and what are the challenges? How do I get there? The first thing they realize is, okay, if I need to get into this, there are some costs I need to understand. So there's the obvious costs of equipment, which is pretty high now because this is a smaller, it's not a scaled industry, it's not a mature industry. And then comes the infrastructure side, the cost of getting power, right? And I see friends at Duke sitting here as well, and they play a critical role. A lot of utility companies across the country have a critical role to play, but this is a new area for everyone. And our customers who've been dealing predominantly with gas, doesn't mean they don't have electric power, but this is now a different kind of power they need to bring to a site. What does it take? How long does it take for me to get permits? Who's going to pay for what? Land ownership. There's a lot of issues that come in to being able to get power and power upgraded at a site. Then as they research more and try and understand the space, they understand there are concepts like demand charges that's going to impact their profitability. And given the low demand of EVs today, everyone knows it's going to come. There are these great projections, as I said, is proving true so far. But till that point, the utilization of these assets is pretty low. And it's a chicken and egg thing. People won't buy cars unless you have those infrastructure assets on ground. I came here from Greensboro, driving an EV. I think that's fine. But if this was in Atlanta, it would be a little bit of a challenge for me to think of driving to Atlanta, much more planning and where I need to stop and for how long, right? So given those constraints, it's pretty important for us to make sure those costs are really understood. As they move along in this journey, they are then doing the math, because this individual in a company has got to present a case to the management saying, yes, it makes sense for us to get in. And the typical question is, what's the investment? What's our return? When do we break even? Questions like that. And and customers ask me this all the time, even today. Right? And my straight answer to them is, if you're looking for an ROI near term, don't get into it. Right? There has to be strategic intent here. And if there's strategic intent, you can get into it. But many of them, once they hear that answer, may want to wait, but that's a reality. And the only way the ROI is offset is by the government stepping in, or other institutions. So today in the US, the biggest sources of funds are either it's a Volkswagen emission fund, which is providing different states funding to get into EVs. And then the second is the utility company funds. So different utilities have different programs to help customers bridge that infrastructure cost. But absent that, the ROI is pretty hard to make, right? So that incentive is really important if you want businesses who are there to make money. And of course, for the broader good, but I think primarily they run by numbers. And if those numbers don't add up, people don't get in. And if the companies don't get in, people don't buy cars. So we've got to solve that problem. As they move along, they'll understand other challenges around, how do you operate and maintain these assets on charging infrastructure? It's new, it's different. Anything that's mechanical, a physical product is going to break. So, what are the costs around operating these in addition to some of the other energy costs that I talked about? And fleets have a similar set of challenges, which include, though it's predominantly depot-based, but what happens if I'm a person operating outside a regional hub and getting interstate transport or long-haul transport, and those are currently not solved by EV. Potentially, there's a hydrogen play there, and that's what the market's banking on. But even within regional routes or at depots, the infrastructure is pretty old, and these buildings need to get upgraded. Same thing at municipalities or other public transit kind of entities. You've got to upgrade that power, and the cost to upgrade all of that is pretty significant. So those are the big challenges that they are struggling with. So I would say it's primarily around the funding upfront, understanding what it takes to operate these, and being able to justify that to the management. So there's high-level challenges, a lot of driver challenges and such, but don't want to take up too much of the time here. We can get into it as we go through the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deepesh, for that insight. All right, so panelists, can you speak to some of the other challenges and considerations associated with the infrastructure of the future? Equity, JJ, you had mentioned a little bit about big data, safety.
Well, sure. One of the things I wanted to comment on, JJ, you didn't tell us everyone would be beautiful in the future too, but I don't know if you noticed from that ad, but just beautiful people. That was great. Yes, yeah, well, it works. And something I didn't mention earlier, I led the General Services Administration in my prior life before coming to WSP. And something that I'm seeing with that agency, and actually, we actually just won the ability to help the federal government transform from fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And that will be significant, but just layering into what Deepesh is saying, the opportunity, and it was showed in the map, there is opportunity from a government standpoint to actually help to stimulate these efforts overall. And that's what we're seeing with the infrastructure funding. Right or wrong, the funding is there, and there's about $7 billion that's coming into that marketplace. That will not be enough, but it is a focus on how do we build out that infrastructure, and it's pushing it quickly, or it's at least quickly for government, but it's pushing it now. And it means that we will have to think critically about how we are actually ready to make that happen in the coordination between energy and private sector who are setting goals and standards, and the share ride companies alongside just individual passengers who are looking to take advantage of that. And our ability to respond from an infrastructure standpoint might be pushed further and faster than we expected. You mentioned equity, and I do think that there is a great opportunity here for us to train a strong mass of our workforce. If there's anything I think we all look at with all of the opportunity out there is who's going to do that work. We also think about what is going to be the cost of that material. We haven't mentioned inflation as much yet, but it certainly is a very, at least short time reality that we have to think about that is impacting both the cost for instruction, the access to materials, the time that we are going to take for us to actually achieve our goals. But that ability of workforce really does have an opportunity and creates an opportunity for us to train and expand the level of people who are in our workforce and their abilities and capabilities going forward.
Yeah, I think moving forward, the transition to this is going to be combination of easy and hard at the same time. The easy part is there's a lot of industries set up to do it. Right now, the credit card industry, for instance, I spoke with them at a conference a couple months ago. They want some kind of biometrics. They have a lot of fraud on the credit card side, so they want the biometrics. So with this, again, with the facial ID getting off the cruise ship or the fingerprint ID, with your cell phone or, the facial ID in the cell phones and things like that, it brings that to it. I mentioned big data. Again, it's what do you do with that? An hour's worth of data is in LA out of just that geofenced area is about 9 petabytes. So when we were doing our pilots, we're really, what do we do with this? And then how do we actually make something logical out of this? I think the other piece of it is the temptation to do technology for technology. You shouldn't do that. You have to have a problem you're solving. You're looking for something that you're doing, something that will make somebody's life better, easier, commute better, things like that. It's, as we go into these new technologies, the privacy side, it's not as bad as it was when I was a child, right? A long time ago. In that, today I have a 40-year-old daughter who, posts on Facebook when she's going to lunch, right? So it's a different demographic, but it's still a problem. It's still, especially when you're working with financial transactions and things like that. So we have to be able to move into the future. And you look at how some of the latest technologies have evolved. How long did it take for everybody to have a cell phone? Right? I still remember party lines, right? When I grew up. On that side, it's, how about Alexa and Siri and all that? How long did it take for people to start you really using that? Not long at all. And there's a real drive, especially in the younger generation, to move into these easy payment systems so they can go forward. I don't think I mentioned too that there's a financial incentive. The estimated market value in 5 years, and this was a long time ago when we did this, was $50 billion. So $50 billion. Now, the car companies see it. That's why they're all doing this. They're not doing this to be nice, right? Why do you think SiriusXM is looking at this? They're losing market share on their streaming services. They want to stay in the vehicle, so, but there's a lot of companies positioned. Apple CarPlay is in most of the cars, Amazon's in most of the cars, Sirius is in most of the cars, and a lot of other people are moving forward. So the transition's there. It's just, we have to make sure that transition doesn't forget the whole population, that there's a part of the population is underbanked, unbanked, that we still have to figure out how to get them used to these systems. We're talking about our transportation infrastructure. We're not talking about, driving a Lexus or something like that. It's important that we move forward with the technologies that will solve problems for people, not the technologies, not that glitzy brass ring out there that we're trying to grab.
Thanks, JJ. Deepesh, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just think it's, like I said before, with EVs, the one thing that's different is the car actually is, a computer on wheels. When you plug in a charger into a car, they talk to each other. Whereas in fueling, you can't directly talk because the connection is liquid fuel that is combustible. Whereas here you're actually having a communication signal. So now this becomes an extended data source, and there's handshakes that, you don't have to depend on. The phone is a great device. Everybody carries one, so you can have it connected, but now the vehicle is directly connected to the environment through infrastructure. So I think that's what you're seeing come together inside a car, where you have high-level integration between whether it's mapping or the vehicle intelligence itself, payments, being able to order stuff when you get to a place, and now you're also connected to infrastructure. So I think that's definitely a great sign that EVs are going to propel even faster. The thing I do want to touch on is also on the equity piece. I think more and more you'll see incentives or funding that really focuses on this part is to make sure that funding goes to areas where there are disadvantaged communities. But it can't be, you have to have a practical implementation of that, because you don't want to put in infrastructure in disadvantaged communities where they can't take advantage of that. So I think there's some balancing there, thinking through how do you make that infrastructure more viable and better utilized. I think there's work to be done, which will be, I think this is a great starting step that funding is driving in that direction. And the last piece around safety, this again, be very focused on EVs. The way EV infrastructure grew up everywhere in the world and here in the US as well, was people started putting in charging networks, and no one really was driving an EV. So to get prime real estate was pretty hard. So they put in chargers wherever the landlord would say, yep, okay, I'm fine. And so you find that EV chargers are in some backlot behind an industrial building, unmanned areas, and that's created a very negative effect on adoption. So people, whether you're man, woman, things may be different depending on who you are or what time of day you're there, but you don't want to be at a charging location. It's not like fueling today, at least it'll get there, but fueling is a 3 to 5 minute transaction. Charging, even at a fast charger, is a 30 to 40 minute transaction. So you're sitting there by yourself in a car and it's late at night, it's not lit, there's no one you can ask or talk to. That's a big consideration. And that's why I think also our incumbent industry, in my industry, which is C-stores and gas stations, have a great role to play, because gas stations by themselves are generally always manned. Many of them are 24/7. If there's something out of order, there's someone there to speak and solve the issue. And the industry has recognized that being well lit and being safe, is important even for traditional fueling. So that transition has already happened. So, really putting in infrastructure as we go forward in areas where you can promise safety to the drivers, and it's not just the notion of safety, but practically having someone there to make sure that safety is provided. So I think that's a key piece there.
Thanks, Deepesh.
Yeah, I just want to address the electric vehicles, and I'm not anti-electric vehicle. I've had one for 7 years, different ones. So, but one of the problems we're seeing is how do they pay for the infrastructure? So, currently North Carolina, there's a surcharge on your registration. In reality, it pays for about what half of my gas car would pay. So how do we do that? So we are working on, through DOT, a pilot with it used to be the I-95 Corridor Coalition, it's now the Eastern Corridor Coalition, with the federal government on a pilot to do a mileage-based user fee, just to be ready. So, and if you look at a mileage-based user fee, my opinion, you can model it to be more equitable. You can model it around geospace. You can model it around, the type of vehicle, the time of day, all that. It could be a lot fairer of a cost or a tax. So, there's that part of it that we have to move forward with. And how do we continue to pay for the bridges and highways? How do we keep that revenue stream constant? And I think as we move into the future and doing this stuff, it's another piece of technology we'll have to work out. And whether it's with the connected car or, a lot of companies now, like the insurance companies, are using the OBD2 port. We still use the transponder. I think that will go away in the next couple of years. All that stuff has to come together. So, we have to still remember, we have to still fund the key things that are keeping our infrastructure going.
And Pam, if I can just add to that, JJ, also going back to the equity point of ensuring that people who are not able to adopt as fast as Deepesh is pointing out, also are not harmed in our process to ensure that we can actually pay for our infrastructure. We don't want to negatively impact the person who, wants to stay with the traditional F-150 as opposed to go to the new one. But we also want to ensure that we are encouraging adoption at the same time. So there is a number of things to balance between those. And in the study that you all are doing with with the USDOT is key part of understanding how to balance those various elements that come into play. But I didn't mention also just access to work and access to various areas will also become an aspect as well. I mean, obviously we can continue to talk about this a long time, but I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I just want to go back to what Deepesh was saying about the recognition of safety. I don't know how many other Tesla drivers are in the room, but we have all been there charging in a dark parking lot alone at night for 20, 30 minutes. And that's, so I'm glad to hear that there's a recognition of, yeah.
Just one thing, since you brought up safety, that's another advantage of a connected vehicle, and it actually came out of the electric side is, besides for seeing the origin destination, we can see hard braking, hard turning. Actually, a lot of apps right now, Tesla, Toyota both have that on their app, so you could score yourself on how you drive, but it also will help us not only design of roads to see where people need to have roads, but also the safety of our existing roads. So if we see constant hard braking in one area and then look at the accident rates, maybe there's something that we need to do to improve that. So there's a lot of pieces of data. Again, that goes back to the data and what's important in that data that we pull out, and for us to make roads safer and make the occupants safer in the cars.
Very good. I think we're about out of time, but is there a burning question from the audience about something else you'd like to know from our esteemed panel on the future of transportation? All right. Well, if not, I want to thank our panelists and thank the audience, and we'll turn it over to Ward and then lunch.
This on. Again, thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation. Enjoyed that. A couple of things. One, we're going to break now for lunch. If you leave a chamber function that goes through lunch hungry, it's on you. So one thing that's worth knowing, food is going to be in the room next door. There's a buffet that is set up there. So go to the room next door, get your food, bring it back in here to dine. And one reason that's going to be important, we're actually going to start our next session not at 12:30. We're going to start it at 12:25, so 5 minutes earlier than we thought. That's going to be a much anticipated conversation around bipartisan federal infrastructure. So that's a dialogue you will not want to miss. So with that, we will adjourn for lunch. So next door, then back in here. Thank you again so much. We'll see you in a few minutes.
I figured out mine. Okay, there we go. All right, that's our first test that we maybe didn't pass with flying colors, but we got it done. So thank you, first of all, for having us here today. I want to thank Ray Starling, my former colleague from the White House, who I miss dearly. He was instrumental helping craft the rural part of the infrastructure package in the Trump administration. I want to thank Mark and the whole team for getting us recruited for this. When they first called, they said, would I come and talk and absolutely do anything for Ray? Happy to do that. But I said, I think I have a better idea, which is instead of just listening to me talk, how about if I bring Nick with me and we can argue at the end of your session about what we think best infrastructure policy is. So we're going to do this a little differently. Instead of having set speeches, we're going to ask each other questions, and they're going to comment on the quality of the answer given. So we'll do this for a bit, and then at the end, we'll open up to the audience for questions and answers. So with that, let me do a quick self-introduction. I'll let Nick do a self-introduction, then we'll dive into it. So as mentioned, my name is DJ Gribben. I have my own consulting firm, Madras. I've spent about 25 plus years in infrastructure, primarily focused on ways to involve private equity in infrastructure in a way that works well for taxpayers. So I've spent time on the private sector side and the public sector side. On the private sector, I work for Koch Industries. I work for Macquarie Capital, which is an Australian investment bank. It's actually the world's largest private investor in infrastructure. And then I work for HDR. On the government side, I was chief counsel of the Federal Highway Administration, general counsel for US DOT, and then special assistant to the president for infrastructure. So most of my background has been focused on transportation infrastructure, but I've also done pretty much every other asset class as well. So with that, Nick?
Well, thanks, DJ, and thank you all for the opportunity to be with you here today. My name is Nick Donahue. I also run my own consulting business, Capital Transportation Consulting. I spent the last 16 years working on surface transportation policy and strategy, almost exclusively at the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I recently just finished up the last 8 years there, working as Deputy Secretary of Transportation. Really kind of the big focus when I was working at the state was the idea that we can always do better, and we're going to prove that government can do better. And we need to build trust kind of with legislators, with the community, with other folks, and push ourselves to kind of do the things that people said we couldn't do to make a meaningful impact in the infrastructure space. And during that time, we were able to enact essentially the largest revenue package in Virginia, completely reform the way we program projects, and more importantly, how we pick them, which let us hold the DOT more accountable for their delivery of projects. Again, trying to build that trust with the public and stakeholders. We also implemented $7 billion of public-private partnerships in Northern Virginia, really addressing essentially every major interstate corridor outside of the DC suburbs. And then we also finally finished a $4 billion rail deal to double Amtrak service between Richmond and DC, but also importantly to expand freight capacity for the Port of Virginia, where we invested $1 billion. And we have the highest rail mode split of any port, except for those West Coast people we won't talk about. But here on the East Coast, we have the highest mode split. And so really looking forward to the discussion here today. And let's do it, DJ.
All right, Nick, let's go. So Nick, I'll ask you the first question, which is, and Nick says we a lot, but as everyone here can appreciate, there's one person in an organization that's the go-to person that makes things happen. And I had the pleasure of watching Nick closely in action. It's remarkable. All those things he listed, he was personally involved in fact, leading many of those things. So Nick.
And I thought you were going to make fun of me because I don't work at the state anymore for saying
I'm softening you up. So Nick, given all of that experience that you have, you've worked in 2 different administrations as Deputy Secretary of Transportation. You've been at the leading edge of a lot of new initiatives and a lot of good thinking around transportation policy. If you could just take those 8 years, bundle them together and boil them down to 3 principles, what would those 3 principles be?
So the first one absolutely is performance. We have got to show the public and show elected officials what we are doing with their dollars and demonstrate that we are actually making a difference with them. There's really a jaundiced view, I think, by a lot of elected officials, folks in the business community, candidly as well, that, well, we keep spending money on transportation. Things kind of seem the same. So I'm not sure what the point is. You had the bridge to nowhere nonsense coming out of DC, 15 years ago, and that's still coloring people's perspective. We've got to show them what we're doing and then track it and really demonstrate. We told you this was going to happen and we actually delivered, and here it is. And so we did that on repeat on projects in Virginia. We tell people this is what's going to do. We would open it, and then we would literally put out quarterly reports. What happened? Were we right? Were we wrong? And look, we were wrong. It's okay. Admitting that actually builds trust. And trust is the second thing that, again, I really want to stress is DOTs, in my opinion, for way too long have not been willing to say no to people. We always wanted to make people feel better or feel happy. And so we'd go to a big public hearing. There'd be a room like this. Each of you would stand up and tell us you had the most unsafe intersection in the state. We'd all nod. Clearly, a lot of you were wrong when you said that. And then we would put a little bit of money in the program in the outer years to make sure you knew we were thinking about you. We had no intention of building that project, but now we listen to you. And there's $2 million for your $20 million project in year 6 of the 6-year program. And the joke's on you because it's staying in year 6. We can't do that type of stuff. We've got to tell people what our resources are, the trade-offs that we're making, so that they can have insight into the decisions. And again, trust that the process is actually working there. The final thing that I would say is government always wants to try and keep things simple, but sometimes things just aren't simple. And occasionally in transportation, you have to take the time to explain the complex things, to do what is meaningful and needs to be done. So JJ was up here earlier talking about, fuel efficient vehicles and hybrids and how are they going to pay into the system. In Virginia in 2013, we passed one of the first hybrid fees in the nation. It was really simple. Hybrids buy less gas. EVs buy less gas. Let's charge them all a fee. So everybody's going to pay $60. That fee was in law for exactly 9 months. It was House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 1 of the next session to repeal that fee, because people could be like, hey, that's not fair. My hybrid gets less miles per gallon than someone's new Civic, and I'm paying this $60 fee. So then we worked on that for a number of years, and we came up with what I will admit to you is a complex fee called the highway use fee, where any car in Virginia that gets more than 25 miles per gallon pays a fee. But importantly, that fee is structured based on their fuel economy and the average miles driven by a driver in Virginia. That was put in place in 2020. It affects thousands upon thousands of cars in Virginia compared to the hybrid fee, which very few people paid. It's still in place 3 years later or 2 years later. And so simple is not always best. Sometimes transportation is complex, and that's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to comment on Nick's comments because that makes it more fun. Unfortunately, in this situation, we're going to be a little boring because I agree with pretty much everything you said. I don't think we have any disagreement on any of those points. I would even point out a story. So former Governor Owens told me how hard it is to get the public, to build public trust in infrastructure. And once he was driving down the road and there were 8 guys, kind of doing the classic standing around a project, leaning on shovels. And he pulled over and he got out of his car and he went up to him, like, you guys are killing me, right? I'm trying to demonstrate how important it is for us to invest in infrastructure. And you're just kind of standing on the highway, not looking very busy. So could you just look busy for me? But they're all the things that Nick said were dead on in terms of transparency, being honest with the public, what you can do, what you can't do, because once you build that public trust, then it becomes incredibly easy, or at least easier, for us to go back to the public and say, okay, we now need resources for our next project. So I'll turn over to you.
Yes. So I think, DJ, I was supposed to ask you a question now about why shouldn't infrastructure decisions be made at the federal level?
Now you asked me the 3 takeaways from the federal.
Oh, I thought we were skipping that part that was there. Okay.
Okay.
So DJ, we're giving this a test here. So DJ, you worked, at basically every senior level in DC. You worked in the White House, you worked at FHWA, you worked at DOT proper there. What would be the 3 things you think are kind of most important for this audience to think about as they consider infrastructure in ways that we can make it better?
Thank you for that question, Nick. The thing that drives me absolutely crazy, and this is a conversations I had over and over again. So when Ray and I were in the White House, we had just the honor and the privilege to meet with lots of governors and mayors and officials. And my friends on the left would say, well, we don't have much money, so let's have the federal government pay for it. And my friends on the right would say, well, we don't want to raise taxes, let's have the private equity pay for it. And I would have to explain to them that, listen, no, that's not how it works. Every infrastructure project is paid for through taxes and user fees. That's it. There are only 2 ways to pay for it. Now, those taxes can go to the federal government and they come back to you, or your taxes go to the state government and come back, or locally, but they're still your taxes we're talking about. And the Wall Street Journal actually ran a piece saying we don't need to raise corporate taxes, we can just use private equity. Now, private equity can be very helpful, but it's a form of financing, not funding. So it's like taking out a loan. You don't have more money because some investor invests in your project. Why? They're an investor. You have to pay them back, right, with interest. So I guess the number one thing is it's really important, and kind of not going back to your point, being honest with the public, there's no free lunch here, right? You are going to pay for it. What we're going to do as the government is we're going to take your payments, whether they're tax or user fees, and we're going to deploy them as efficiently as possible. So that would be kind of number one. Number 2 is infrastructure, as Nick pointed out, it's not as simple as it used to be, right? There are 2 candidates recently that talked a lot about infrastructure. One, Governor Whitmer of Michigan. I loved her ads, if you didn't see them. Her motto was, fix the damn roads, right? That's it, just fix the damn roads. Let's fill the potholes. Why are we talking about this? Let's fix the roads. I'm going to be slightly critical, and I'll be more critical later, of the Biden administration's approach, which is we're going to do infrastructure, but we're also going to, think about climate change and equity and unionization and all these other elements. And while those all can be important, I think as we expect our infrastructure to do more and more and more other than just be infrastructure, we're moving into a new environment when it comes to infrastructure policy. And then lastly, and I spent a lot of time on this, the permitting process we have, and we spent a lot of time in the Trump administration trying to simplify it. It's one of the world's worst permitting process among the developing world. It takes forever. You consider tons of factors. There was a project in Ohio where if you stack the documents up, they would be taller than this ceiling, right? To study the environmental impact of a bridge. Now, should we say environmental impacts? Absolutely. We'll talk about externalities later. Like if a project does damage to the environment, either you need to avoid it or you need to mitigate it. There's just no excuse. But do you need to do a 5, 6, 7 year long process to sort of realize what the impact is going to be? And we lag most of the developing world than that. So it's let's think clearly about where the money comes from. Let's understand that the conversation's changing and adapt. And then let's get a process where we can actually build these projects and get them underway in a reasonable period of time.
Weirdly, again, DJ, I actually agree with you here. I want to add just an example on the permitting process. I don't know if you guys have ever done big rail projects here in North Carolina, but when you're doing a highway, you actually get to pick where you want it to go, and you get to pick the alternatives that you study. If you want to do a rail project, you have to tell FRA what you think the alternatives should be, and then they get to tell you whether or not those are the right ones to study, and then they get to tell you which one you can build or should be the preferred alternative. You, as a person paying for it, don't get to nominate the project. So let me just give you an example of how ludicrous this can be. I told you about the $4 billion project to double rail service between Richmond and DC. Well, about 20 miles north of Richmond is this very, very nice former railroad town called Ashland. The governor's chief of staff also happens to live in Ashland. Just a side note, kind of important later as we go down this. The railroad tracks run straight through the middle of town. There's literally roads on both sides, and in the heart of downtown hugs the railroad tracks. This is only a half mile long. This corridor is 110 miles long. The FRA at one point was telling us we had to study adding a third track through Ashland. Clearly, the people of Ashland were upset because they thought we were going to bulldoze their downtown. We told the FRA that was ludicrous, and I stand by that statement because it's a half mile on a 110-mile corridor. We can make anything work for half a mile, but they made us study it, and they made us hold public hearings on it, and this entire project almost collapsed for something we knew we were never going to do. There was no way we were going to knock down Ashland to get an extra half mile of third track. That is silly, just on its face. And they made us study it. And then the worst part was we sent the document there, and we didn't know if they were going to pick that alternative and let us know that that was in fact our preferred alternative where we could spend our own money. That is not the way the world should work. Just like to put it very simply. So I just wanted to.
And how did the story end?
The story ended very happily. We are not knocking down downtown Ashland. Everybody came to their senses and realized that, in fact, it's okay for a half mile to have just 2 tracks on a 110-mile long corridor. You can make it work.
All right, so that is a great segue into the next question, which is, as you think about infrastructure policy over time, it's becoming more and more federalized. So the vast majority, like 90% of infrastructure is owned at the state local level. But as the federal government is getting more and more involved, I guess my question to Nick is, and we'll be a little more provocative here, like, is there really, given that all this local infrastructure is locally or state owned, is there a meaningful role for the federal government?
My answer is absolutely, as a former state official. And again, remember, DJ is a former federal official, so it's kind of a weird take here. And my rhetorical question back to DJ, and then I'm going to keep talking so he can't immediately answer and undercut me, is do you like the interstate highway system? Because without the federal government, guess what we wouldn't have? The interstate highway system. Do you like the air traffic control system and the ability to fly across the country? Noting that it could be better. I'll just, caveat there. I'm not saying it's the best, but absent some sort of federal intervention, how would we have the standards to safely fly planes across the country? DJ, you could have gotten here from Virginia to North Carolina without the federal government's intervention in transportation policy. Now, let's just take it a step further. I also think that what the federal government can do with grants, and I know we're going to talk about that later, so I don't want to get into too much, is to push states and local governments through competition to be better and to try harder things. I think if we're all being honest in this room, we know that there are politicians that sometimes push projects that maybe don't have the highest benefits, but they're a very senior politician. And so we're all going to make that a priority and go along with it. You need somebody somewhere occasionally to say, maybe that's not the best idea. And I think competition, where projects are evaluated against each other, and you say, we know this is a really important project for you, and I'm sure it's a good project. There are just a lot better projects, is a very useful feedback loop when there are projects out there with champions that are pushing things that probably aren't the best things to use with your limited dollars. The opportunity costs are just way too great. My other kind of provocative thing, and then I will give it away, is, well, if the federal government has no role in infrastructure, why should the state? Screw it. Let's just send it to the local level. Put all the money down at the local level with government closest to the people. Is that the answer?
No, that is not the answer. And mainly because there are issues, and you see this in communities across the country, where communities will make infrastructure decisions that are so local that they're not helpful to the state or the region overall. So it is good to have some level between the federal government and the local government. The concern that I would have about the federal government's role is, yes, I love the interstate. It's completed. Like, we completed it 40 years ago. It's almost as if you hired someone to add an addition to your house, they added the addition to your house, and they came back. It's like, what can I do next? Well, okay, we'll look at the roof. And like, at a certain point, we're out of projects, right? And so did the federal government play a critical role in the interstate? Yes. Why? Two reasons. One, federal government was able to raise money very inexpensively, right? And it was able to socialize costs so that you could have highways across Wyoming or North Dakota, and we could be connected as a nation. I think the challenge is we did such a good job at that, we kept giving sort of the wrong player responsibility for a totally different mission that we're on now. And most US infrastructure challenges, whether it's water, broadband, even highways, transit, almost all the needs are local currently. So our need has evolved, but our delivery mechanism is sort of stuck in the same role. Why is that important? Because with every federal dollar comes 99, literally 99 federal requirements of how that dollar must be spent. Now, I'm not saying that those are necessarily bad policies, but the sheer weight of that means that we're losing about 25 cents on every dollar that we spend. So you spend $1 to Washington, by the time it works its way back to a project that's impacting you and your family, you've lost about 25 cents of the spending power of that dollar. Secondly, and a mutual friend of ours is running a DOT, and she said, she brought her staff together and she said, listen, what do we want to accomplish as a team? Like, what is our mission? How do we want the world to be different in this state when it comes to transportation? And her team came back and said, here's what we have federal funds for. So, okay, well, thank you. But that really wasn't the question. The question is, what should we be trying to accomplish? And again, the answer came back, well, here's what we can afford to spend because here are the federal funds and sort of the buckets that they fit in. And so the federal spending not only is, it's inexpensive to collect, but it's quite expensive to spend. But then the federal rules can actually shape a program with a bit of a one size fits all that doesn't best meet the needs of that community. And the air traffic control system. So I'm the wrong person to bring that up with, because we tried to privatize the air traffic control system because when I was general counsel in 2007, I was part of a team that was working on next gen. So we're gonna change the technology to allow us to better identify exactly where aircraft are. That would actually allow us to fly airplanes closer together. While that sounds scary, it's not, because if you know really where they are and you have this technology in place, you can get more capacity. That's 2007. We had a special committee that was going to speed that along. 2022, there's now a next gen office that's fully staffed that's still working on how we can speed along the implementation of that technology. So I love our safety record. I love the FAA, but there's probably a better way. In fact, there certainly is, because Canada is doing it. There's a better way to move airplanes through the sky than we're doing currently. And I do want to point out, however, there certainly is a federal role, right? Comes to safety. If you think about EV charging, like where do we place the chargers? If you're talking interstate traffic, that makes sense. There's certainly a place, but I feel like we did this amazing, like historical thing in the 50s with the Highway Act, and we created the interstate system, and we're still kind of trying to milk that award that we won. You know, it's like we won the state championship in high school, and we're 70 years old and we're still talking about it.
Still get your Letterman jacket on?
Exactly. No, you've got your Letterman jacket on. I'm saying, hey, let's move on. All right.
So I can't let that. I can't let this. I can't let that go. I'm sorry. So there's 99 requirements apparently that come along with federal funds. I haven't taken the time to count them, but I'm pretty sure DJ has. So I'm gonna accept that, and I'll stipulate that it's accurate. Do you know what some of those requirements are? Say out loud what you're planning to build. Hold a public hearing. Could you imagine if a DOT just built a road and didn't tell anyone they were going to build it or hold a public hearing on it? So not all requirements are bad, even though we can say they're requirements. Let me give you another example of a federal requirement. In 1991, when the Congress declared the interstate system complete, they established something called the Highway Bridge Program. The bridge program has requirements and restrictions and does dictate to states how they can use their funds. You know what the dictate was? Fix your bridges. An interesting thing happened over the next 2 decades. We went from having about 20% of the bridges in the nation being structured efficient to about 10%. So again, that is a requirement, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There clearly probably are some really bad federal requirements. So just as TJ recognizes the federal role, I don't want to say that every single federal thing, after particularly I bashed the FRA earlier, I hope they're not in the room. Like clearly some of those things could be changed, but I don't think we can just say because a requirement initiated at the federal level that it was bad. Because clearly the bridge program got states to do something that if they were actually had a good asset management system and were taking care of their system and monitoring performance, they would have been doing anyway, because a lot of states weren't doing it for whatever reason. I don't know what that reason was. I honestly don't care. What I know is that the results kind of speak for themselves in that type of area. And I had another point, but I forgot about it because I got so excited about the bridge program. So I'll let that move on.
All right, so we're breaking with our initial ground rules because I'm now going to rebut his rebuttal. I'm going to use Mayor Eric Garcetti, right? Not exactly like a right-wing libertarian leader, right? Very liberal, great leader from Los Angeles. And his analogy was that we have these really good ideas, like Nick said, should you tell the public about your project? Yes. I would question whether the federal government must mandate states to do that, since I'm pretty sure states would be doing that anyway. But we have a good idea, and it's a federal requirement. And it's like a rock. And we take the rock and we put it in our backpack. And then we've got another rock and another rock and another rock. And now we've got so many good ideas in the backpack, we can't move. And he was trying to develop housing for the homeless in Los Angeles and actually just couldn't get it permitted. Now, these weren't federal rules; these were state and local rules. But I do think that the part of the complexity of having the federal government have these mandates is there are times and places where this rule may not make sense. But if it's a federal mandate, you don't have the ability to skip over that. You still have to go through the whole compliance regime, even if in the case of the FRA, it sort of just doesn't make sense in this circumstance. But speaking of the federal government's role, I'm going to circle back and we'll talk about this for a little bit, and then we'll go to Q&A. Circle back to the changing complexity. I mentioned before, so the Biden administration has looked at infrastructure in a much broader way than we have historically. Normally infrastructure, you think roads, bridges, airports, utilities, kind of your classic infrastructure. The Biden administration expanded it out in the Build Back Better to a lot of social programs, but I won't go there. Let's just focus just on core infrastructure. The priorities in past administrations have been things like congestion relief, freight movement, efficiency. Now it's climate change, equity, unionization. Are those issues appropriate for infrastructure?
So first off, I'm going to object to the premise of your question.
That's good.
So just to put things in perspective, with this federal transportation bill, everybody has a different name for it. I'm just gonna call it the IIJA because that's stuck in my head. I'm sorry. But I mean, that's what I mean. When I say that, I mean the federal bill. So the IIJA is sending out for surface transportation, because I don't know broadband or the other sectors like DJ does. So I'm going to further narrow them just into surface transportation. It's going to spend something like $60 billion this year. 52 billion is distributed by formula to the states, where the states make the decision on how those dollars are spent. So to say that the priority the federal government has put on all these federal transportation dollars is anything the federal government can control, I kind of struggle with, because the vast majority of the money is still just going to the states, where they're going to choose how to spend it. Granted, with 99 requirements, but I don't think the president can control those requirements. They're just in law. Now, with the grants, clearly the administration has the ability to put in place policy priorities about how things will evaluate it. A few kind of thoughts on that is, first, transportation is not an end unto itself. Like, we don't build roads so we can drive in circles with like utter glee, screaming at the top of our lungs, going 80 miles an hour, like, this is awesome. That's not why we do it. It's a means to an end. And those ends are things that people value. And we have to understand what those are. And so congestion, that's a priority. If you read the grant criteria the Biden administration still put out, guess what's still in there? Congestion. Safety has always been a priority. Again, if you read the grant criteria they put out, guess what's in there? Safety. Another thing that's in there, and is a little bit more amorphous, is economic development. And that's clearly like a value judgment. That means different things to different people in different places. And I think the reason you're starting to see some of these other criteria be considered is these are things where we've seen transportation have negative impacts. And we're now saying they should be thought about as we make some of our transportation decisions. It's not the sole factor or the sole rationale as to why we pick a project, but it is something that we need to think about as we consider these projects. And an example I would give you is like a farm. So you're on a farm, you're a farmer, you grow crops, you have cattle, you do whatever else farmers do. I've clearly never farmed. And you found this thing that you can do in your field to just be the most efficient plowing thing that you do with plows on farms. Again, never done that, but it's great. You're so much faster at it, but you find out several years down the line, it's creating runoff that's getting into your stream. And that's why your cows have been dying. Remember, you grow things and you have cows. Those are the two, it's all a system here. That's what we've done in transportation. We've found things that really improve certain processes, but they had negative impacts in other parts of our community. And so if you were that farmer and you figured out your really cool plowing technology was making your cows sick, would you start to think about whether or not how you plowed made your cow sick in the future? Or would you say, no, that's inappropriate to consider as we plow this field?
I love Nick's farming analogies. So I agree with the importance of considering negative externalities in any kind of public policy. I think one of the challenges that we have, and I think we saw this a little bit during COVID, right? The focus was how do we keep people physically healthy? And maybe we didn't focus as much as we should have on mental health, on education, on other elements that would be negative externalities of just shutting the economy down, right? So 100% on board on the negative externality side of it. I guess the challenge that I have is it's a little bit of combination of the 99 rocks. So are we adding the 100 and 101st rock? But it's also really good public policy is easy to comply with, right? When I used to lobby for small businesses, lobbied at NFIB. The vice president's office called, this is during the George H.W. administration, and said, could you send us a list of the regulations that apply to small business? And so I went through the federal regulations, And it's a stack that's this high. And those are federal regulations. So you need to multiply by 4 or 5 to convert to plain English. And what I was worried about is like, are we actually creating a nation of lawbreakers because no small business could ever comply with all those regs? Most publics could actually even understand them. And then I talked to my Uncle Ray, out in Casper, Wyoming, who had a welding shop. And Uncle Ray had an OSHA inspector come by and inspect it and found about 20 grand. This is a while ago, so that was real money. 20 grand with improvements. And, Uncle Ray wanted to be responsible, wanted to be safe. So he made all the improvements. And then 6 months later, an OSHA inspector comes by. Uncle said, oh, no. You guys have already been here. And the inspector, I'm not making this up, said, oh, no. That inspector only deals with this half of our regs. I deal with the other half of the regs because, wait for it, quote, you can't expect one person to know all of our regulations. And his response was like, but I'm supposed to? And so we have there's a lot of regulations out there, there's a lot of good for those regulations. But my point is, if, the Obama administration, we had livability, very noble goal, but I just don't know what that means. Similarly, climate change, like what degree of climate change? Equity, well, exactly how do I apply it? And not these aren't noble goals, but we can spend so much time trying to figure out what that means and comply with it, that we actually, at the end of the day, we don't build infrastructure. And here's my number one worry. It goes back to what Nick said about public trust. Okay, so we went to the public and we said, we are going to take $1 trillion and we're going to mortgage it from your children and your grandchildren, and we're going to apply it to this critical priority we're calling infrastructure. And we did that. And we said, we're going to produce jobs and we're going to improve, our economy, and things will be more efficient and people have access to broadband and there'll be equity and there'll be climate change and all of that. But you know what? If you can't permit the project, you don't get any of those benefits. And I guess what concerns me a little bit is that we will add so many things that are noble goals we want to accomplish in developing this infrastructure that at the end of the day, we won't be able to deliver the infrastructure. And then we need, inevitably, because infrastructure, you have to go back because it has to be maintained, it has to be updated. The public's going to say, well, wait a minute, didn't we just do that?
There's no OSHA for transportation. So I appreciate what the gentleman in Wyoming had to go through. And
that was my Uncle Ray.
Uncle Ray. Okay. I sympathize with Uncle Ray. Guess what's not happening in transportation because of any change that has happened since President Biden was inaugurated? That. So what has happened is on discretionary grants, they have said, we want you to consider safety, congestion, economic development, and we also want you to consider some other things. Remember, that's 8 billion of the 60 billion that's going out there. So with the vast majority of funds, nothing like that is happening. And then what they are saying is, we want to look at projects as we award discretionary grants, and we're going to consider a variety of factors. I really want to stress this because I'm going to go back, and I know DJ said we're going to questions, but I believe the first real competitive grant program at the federal level was established when a certain friend of mine, who maybe is sitting to my right, was the chief counsel for FHWA. And I believe what you guys did at that time, what my friend did at that time is you took a bunch of money and you said, you can get this if you do certain things that at that time, many people weren't talking about because you wanted to influence their behavior. I happen to believe you were right. My friend was right with what he did then, but I think we've seen this in the past and we've actually seen it work out okay. I think the difference is this time is in the past, you were more comfortable with some of those ideas, and this time you're less comfortable. And that's, in my mind, just the ebb and flow of democracy.
That was well done. I like that. The only thing, so my friend to my left is the smartest guy in transportation policy, but the only mistake he made is that these policies are being applied in current environmental permitting processes. So it's not just grants and formula funds. They are actually being applied to some of the formula funds, but we'll give him that one. I do like the, hey, it was good when you were there. And now it's, for some reason, this is bad. So, okay, on that note, let's open up for questions and answers. And we're happy to talk about anything. At least I am. I prefer confrontational questions. If anybody has one of those. Yes, sir. Do you have a confrontational question? But go ahead. Oh, are we waiting for microphones? Please wait for the microphone. It's on our way.
So by extension, using your rock analogy, who's in the position to determine which rocks go in the backpack and which don't? And by extension, why does the backpack get filled with rocks if there wasn't a Sisyphus in the first place to circumvent the requirements?
I'm sorry, if there wasn't a what in the first place?
Sisyphus.
Oh, Sisyphus being pushing the rock up the hill.
So I'll give not an indirect answer, and then DJ will come back with something else. So most of these rocks are in there for what initially started out as a really good reason. So like, I don't know if any of you have ever read The Power Broker. It's like a tome, but if you love infrastructure and you're an infrastructure nerd like I am, you read that. It's like, I don't know, 10,000 pages about Robert Moses. And this guy built highways, all the highways in New York City. And some of the stuff he did was he actually built roads without public hearings. So like DJ said, like, why would you do that? He then, when they knocked down apartment buildings, told people to go to a certain address to get relocation assistance. And the address was just a vacant building. This happened. So guess what happened because of that? The Uniform Relocation something Assistance Act exists. That's now a rock in the backpack.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone is going to Robert Moses relocation like type of things anymore. Just like outright lie to people like, yeah, go to 112 First Street and they're going to help you. And again, there's nobody at 112 First Street, but like, that's how the rocks get there. There's typically something that happens that we all kind of agree is bad. And then it gets put in that backpack.
Yeah, and part of the challenge is if it's put in the federal backpack as opposed to a state backpack or a local backpack, it then becomes significantly harder to take the rock out of the backpack. And every time a rock goes into a backpack, magically there appears a lobbying community in support of that rock. So that didn't exist before. But yeah, Robert Moses did horrific things. He built bridges deliberately low so buses couldn't go through because he didn't want poor people going to the beach. Right. I mean, it was a bad man. If you read the book,
This isn't conjecture. This is actually like documented. So like, that's why the rocks become together. And to DJ's point, at a certain point, maybe one rock and another rock cancel out the need for the other one. And it's really hard just sometimes to get that rationalized through the regulatory process or through congressional action. People have tried. They've been successful in certain areas and they've been less successful in other areas.
There's also the dynamic. If you're a member of Congress, an elected official, you want to create your program. You get a lot of kudos for that. Taking existing programs that don't really work anymore out and spending your time on that, not a higher rate of return of investment. And so there's a lot of focus. So we had even in our bill, we had a worker training section. Okay. Does anyone want to guess when our worker training section passed, would that be the second or third worker training program? No, it would be the 48th worker training program. Why? Now remember, Congress go back and say, well, this year we created a worker training program, ignoring the 47 that already existed and trying to work on them. So anyway, next question. There was one. Yes, sir.
So we're looking at collectively new ways for funding transportation, different levels. From maybe not confrontational, maybe something interesting. What would be the best way to screw up a public-private partnership?
Oh, there's so many ways to do that.
We only have 3 minutes.
We only have 3. So I'll do a lightning round on best way. 1, select the wrong project. 2, select the wrong partner. 3, negotiate the wrong contract. 4, don't enforce the right contract you did negotiate. 5, don't oversee the project correctly. And 6, don't explain to people what you're doing and why it's in their benefit.
That is exactly right. The thing to really remember with P3s is most P3 statutes waive your procurement practice. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be bumpers or governors on the process. There absolutely should be. It just means the people implementing it have to self-impose those things through the process to make sure that you don't do any of those things that DJ talked about. In Virginia, we had a private partner we worked with, and I'm going to steal their line, but I'm telling you, I stole it from them. And they used to say, A public-private partnership is marriage without divorce. So we better know what we're getting in bed to do. Like, we're not going to get out of here. This contract exists. Like, and it's true. There is no real way to get out of that contract besides a ton of money changing hands. And so you need to be very thoughtful upfront about what you're doing. Tell the public the trade-offs, tell them the things you're going to do. Their risk, that's okay. And you don't need to have a P3 product with no risk. That's silly. The thing is to get the right balance of risk between the public and the private sector. And you've really got to tell people what is in these deals before they're signed. Virginia used to have a practice where they could go in a room and negotiate with people in private, and they would come out the other side with terms they had never told elected officials about. And if you think about this, this is not the governor, not the Secretary of Transportation, but the VDOT commissioner is the one signing these deals. So we're like 3 levels away from anyone who gets elected by a voter. They're signing multi-billion-dollar contracts that last for 5 decades and have potentially very, very expensive clauses in them. So but the flip side is I don't want to scare you away from P3s. DJ and I think P3s is an extremely important tool for states to use. If you do it right, the benefits are just, they are extremely real, but you have to do it in a deliberative, thoughtful way, or you can get really, really bad outcomes.
Good question. Very good question. Any other questions? Are you raising your hand in the back or no? All right. Any questions, Nick? Did we miss anything? Did we cover all the stuff we were supposed to cover?
We skipped a few things, but it's fine.
We skipped a few things in order of time. So, well, thank you very much for having us. It's been great being here. Appreciate all the questions and your attention, and hopefully get a chance to see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
DJ, Nick, thank you both very much. I can tell you there's some aggregate producers in this room today, and we're very moved by the rocks in the backpack analogy today. So we're grateful for that. Before we conclude, I need to make sure that we offer our sincere thanks to our speakers, our sponsors, and everyone in attendance today, both in person and virtually. What you're all doing together to try to make North Carolina better, safer, and more competitive in this dimension is important. It's important for our business today. It's important for our lives and generations of North Carolinians to come. One thing that we do want to do is every year when we do this, we want to do it better. And you have the ability to help us do that better. At your tables is a survey form that if you would fill that out, we would be enormously grateful. If you're watching it virtually, there's also a QR code that you can scan. And if you're particularly moved and you want to spend more time thinking about this, when you do get the email that's going to have some of the information that will have the videos and likewise for this, you will also have the ability to present a survey with that. So also as a final reminder, the Chamber continues to offer webinars and exclusive membership programs. In addition to these annual events, you can visit the ncchamber.com for more details. And by the way, coming up in the not too distant future is the Workplace DEI Conference on June 9th, as well as a series of other upcoming events. With that, we are concluded. But again, thank you so much. It's great to see all of you in person. Please leave here safely, drive carefully, and we hope to see you again at another North Carolina Chamber event very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.